You rise slowly, your joints making no sound, and the packed earth floor receives the weight of your wooden shoes with a soft, muffled thud. These shoes are old, the wood worn smooth and dark from years of crossing this same floor, the straw stuffing inside shaped to the exact contour of your feet. You take a woolen vest from a peg by the door and pull it over your linen shirt, the fabric smelling faintly of wood smoke and lanolin and the dried lavender that was tucked among the folds last summer. The door is a heavy plank affair, its iron hinges greased with tallow so that when you lift the latch and pull it inward, it swings without a creak. You step onto the threshold and the world outside comes into view all at once, yet so softly that it feels more like a continuation of the indoor gloom than a separate place. A thick silver mist has settled over everything during the night, clinging to the orchard that stretches away from the farmhouse in neat, ancient rows. The mist is dense enough to obscure the far end of the orchard, the trees there fading into a pale nothingness, while the nearer trees stand with a strange clarity, every bare branch and twisted limb outlined in droplets of condensed moisture. The grass between the rows is long and flattened, silvered with dew, and here and there a windfall apple lies half hidden in the wet blades, its skin wrinkled and brown, giving off a faint, sweet tart scent of natural fermentation that mingles with the clean, cold smell of the mist itself. You remain standing in the open doorway, one hand resting on the rough wooden frame, and you let your gaze travel slowly across the scene without any need to hurry. There are 26 trees in the near orchard, you know, because you have counted them many times on many similar mornings, though today you do not count them again, merely register their presence as a familiar silence. The trees are gnarled and old, their bark cracked in vertical patterns that hold tiny rivulets of moisture, their branches trained over decades into goblet shapes that catch the mist and hold it. The harvest was completed weeks ago, on a bright windy day in early autumn, when the orchard was filled with the sound of ladders being shifted and apples dropping into wicker baskets. Now the branches are bare except for a few stubborn leaves that cling to the tips, brown and curled, shivering almost imperceptibly when a breath of air moves through the mist. That breath of air comes rarely, and when it does it is so slight that it stirs only the finest droplets suspended in the mist, making them swirl in lazy spirals before settling back into stillness. The temperature is such that you cannot feel a difference between your skin and the air around it. There is no chill distinct enough to cause a shiver, no warmth to suggest the sun will burn through. Everything rests in a perfect balance of coolness and calm. Your eyes follow the line of a low stone wall that separates the orchard from the lane leading to the village. The stones are grey and rounded, gathered from the fields generations ago, and they wear thick coats of pale green lichen that blows softly in the diffuse light. Beyond the wall, the lane disappears into the mist within a dozen paces, and no sound travels along it, no cartwheels or hoofbeats or distant voices. The village, with its church spire and its market square, might as well be 100 leagues away, or 100 years. Here, in the bowl of the valley where the farmhouse sits, the only world that exists is the one you can see through the mist, and that world is small and complete. You shift your weight slightly and the wood of the threshold creaks once, a single low note that is swallowed immediately by the damp air. A crow that has been sitting on the topmost branch of the nearest apple tree hears the sound and responds by lifting its wings in a slow, deliberate movement. It flaps from the branch to a fence post at the corner of the orchard, its flight unhurried, its wings making a soft whoop, whoop, that fades as soon as the bird settles again. The crow tucks its head down into its shoulders and becomes motionless, a black shape among the grey, indistinguishable from the silence. You notice the quality of the light more than its quantity, because there is so little of either. The mist filters the morning into a directionless glow that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. There are no shadows on the ground, no distinct patches of brightness or darkness. Every object, from the stone wall to the wooden fence to the curve of your own hand, appears slightly luminous, as if the mist has been absorbed into its surface and is now radiating outward with a soft internal light. The effect is one of deep, quiet uniformity, a visual hush that calms the mind by giving it nothing sharp to grasp. Behind you, inside the farmhouse, the kettle continues its steady murmur, a sound so constant that it has become part of the architecture of the morning. The embers shift with a tiny crackle, and then a larger piece of wood settles, sending a brief flicker of orange light across the hearthstone. The smell of wood smoke drifts out through the open door, mixing with the mist and the apple-sweet scent of the orchard, creating a layered aroma that is the smell of late autumn itself, the smell of home and rest and the closing of the year. You look down at the packed earth immediately before the threshold, a small apron of bare ground that has been trodden flat by countless footsteps over countless seasons. The surface is dark with moisture, and your wooden shoes have left shallow impressions that are already filling with a thin film of water. The earth is cold but not frozen, still pliable underfoot, and it releases a rich mineral scent that rises to meet the damp air. You recall without urgency that this small patch of ground freezes hard in the deepest winter, and that by January the wooden shoes will clop against it with a sound like stones knocking together. But that is months away, a season that belongs to a different world entirely. Your attention drifts to the cellar door, which is set into the ground a few paces to the left of the farmhouse. A pair of angled wooden doors that cover a staircase descending into the earth. The doors are closed, their iron ring handles lying flat, their heavy planks darkened by rain and time. The cellar beneath them holds the barrels of cider that were pressed in September, and you know without having to check that the fermentation is now finished, that the lees have settled, that the cider is clear and ready to be racked. This knowledge is a quiet fact, like the knowledge that the sun will set this evening and rise again tomorrow. It carries no excitement, no anticipation, only the simple certainty of a task waiting to be done in its proper time. You do not move toward the cellar doors yet. There is no call to do so, no pressure from the morning, no schedule written anywhere except in the slow rhythm of the farm itself. The cider can wait another hour or two, or until the mist lifts enough to let a paler light into the cellar. For now, standing in the doorway with the cool mist on your face and the warmth of the hearth at your back, you let the quiet stretch out around you like a vast, invisible sea. The only sound that punctuates the stillness, aside from the kettle and the settling fire, is the distant drip of moisture from the eaves of the farmhouse roof. Somewhere above your head, where the thatch overhangs the stone wall, a single drop of condensed mist gathers on a straw tip, swells, and falls onto the packed earth with a soft, distinct pat. Then another drop forms and falls, and another, each one separated by a long, measured interval of silence. A rhythm so slow and regular that it seems to be counting out the seconds of a day that has no need to be counted. You listen to this drip for a long time, and as you listen, the sound seems to merge with your own breathing, until you are no longer sure whether you are hearing the water or the quiet pulse of your own blood. The mist shows no sign of lifting. If anything, it appears to thicken slightly as the morning progresses, the furthest trees retreating further into the grey, the outline of the stone wall softening to a mere suggestion. The world contracts gently, pulling in around the farmhouse like a blanket being tucked around a sleeping child. Somewhere out in that whiteness, the land continues in its familiar patterns. The meadow sloping down to the stream, the copse of hazel and alder, the lane curving toward the village. But none of it is visible now, and none of it matters. The only real things are the things you can see and touch. The wooden doorframe, the damp earth, the silent trees, the closed cellar doors. You think, in a slow and drifting way, about the cider down there in the dark. You picture the barrels standing in their rows on wooden cradles, the chalk marks on their heads denoting the pressing dates, the air inside the cellar cool and constant, smelling of old oak and fermenting fruit. You imagine the surface of the cider, still now after weeks of bubbling, covered with a thin film of yeast, the liquid beneath it clarifying day by day as the sediment sinks. The process is complete, and the next step is a simple one. Siphon the clear cider into a clean barrel, leaving the lees behind. This task is one you have performed many times in many years, and each time it has been the same unhurried, methodical work, a task that asks nothing of you but patience and a steady hand. The crow on the fence post stirs again, shifts its feet, and then tucks its beak under a wing. A few droplets of mist slide down the stone wall and disappear into the moss. The drip from the eaves continues its slow count, and the mist holds everything in a perfect, suspended stillness. You feel the floorboards of the farmhouse settle slightly under your feet, a faint creak that speaks of timber adjusting to the day's humidity, and then that sound, too, is absorbed into the grey quiet. Your hand, resting on the doorframe, is pale in the diffuse light, the knuckles a little reddened from years of work in damp air, the fingernails short and clean. You can see the fine lines of your skin, the small nicks and calluses that have become part of you, and you observe them without judgment, as you might observe the bark of the apple trees or the lichen on the stones. Everything here is weathered, worn smooth by time, and in that weathering there is a deep, unspoken comfort. After a while, you become aware that the quality of the light has shifted, though so minutely that at first you doubt the observation. The mist is perhaps a shade lighter than it was, the grey edging almost imperceptibly towards silver. This does not mean the sun is breaking through. The cloud cover above the mist is thick and unbroken. It means simply that the morning is advancing, that somewhere beyond the valley the world is turning, and that the day is moving forward at its own unalterable pace. You accept this change without needing to respond to it. The day will unfold as it wills, and you will move with it, neither ahead nor behind. At last, you step back from the threshold and turn slowly toward the interior of the farmhouse. The fire needs another log, and there is bread on the sideboard and a cup of last year's cider that will taste of dried apples and honey. The cellar will still be there when you're ready, cool and dark and patient, and the cider in its barrels will continue its silent sleep until you come to wake it. You close the heavy door with the same quiet care with which you opened it, and the mist outside presses against the small windows, a soft white presence that watches over the orchard and asks for nothing at all. The stone steps leading down into the cellar are worn into shallow curves by a century of feet, their centers smoothed to a dull polish that catches the lantern's edge of light and holds it in a thin, wavering ribbon. You feel the shift before you see it, a coolness that presses not against your skin, but seems to pass through it. A slow exhalation of the earth itself rising to meet the warmth of the day above. Each step downward deepens this coolness by a small degree, as if the air were layered in invisible strata that you part with your shoulders, and by the time your wooden shoe touches the packed clay floor, you have left the season of mist and morning entirely, entering a place where temperature is a constant, patient thing that asks nothing and remembers nothing. The lantern in your hand steadies as you set it onto the low stone shelf carved into the wall, and the flame behind its horn pane ceases its nervous flicker, settling into a tall, calm teardrop of yellow light. That light reaches out with a gentle reluctance, touching the nearest surfaces and then falling back, so that the far corners of the cellar remain in a darkness that is soft rather than heavy. The ceiling is low enough that you could raise your palm and press it flat against the rough beams that cross overhead. Old oak trunks split down their middles and set into the stonework, their undersides stained dark from generations of rising moisture and the slow breath of fermenting barrels. Cobwebs hang between these beams in loose grey arcs, so fine that they tremble only when you pass beneath them, reacting to the faint disturbance of air that your presence creates, then returning to perfect stillness. The walls are built of limestone blocks laid without mortar in the oldest section, though later hands have pointed the joints with clay and straw in places where the chill found its way through. You can run your fingertips along the stone and feel the slight grittiness of mineral salts that have leached out over the decades, leaving a pale bloom like the skin of a plum. The surface is never truly dry, not in the way a sun-warmed wall is dry, but holds a cool dampness that is clean and odorless, the kind of moisture that speaks only of deep groundwater and the slow drip of time. In one corner, a single bead of water gathers on a protruding flint, growing fat and pendulous over the course of many minutes before it releases and falls onto a small dark stain in the clay below, a spot that has been receiving such drops since long before you were born and will continue long after. A clock without hands. The floor is packed earth, mixed with crushed limestone chippings and pounded flat by generations of boots and wooden clogs, its surface now hardened to a mottled grey-brown that puffs no dust when you walk. Scattered across it are thin patches of fine sand, carried in on the soles of harvest workers and swept toward the walls by the gentle slope of the floor, which tilts almost imperceptibly toward a narrow channel cut along the eastern wall. That channel, no wider than your hand, leads to a small sump where any excess water might gather. Though it has been dry for months, its bottom lined with a skin of fine, cracked silt that curls at the edges like old parchment. Nothing moves across this floor, not a beetle nor a spider. For the constant coolness makes this a place of suspension, a pause in the busy life of the soil. Against the walls and down the center in two orderly rows rest the great barrels. They are made of oak from the forests near St. Lo, their staves cut and shaped by coopers whose names are recorded only in the parish ledger, and they sit on cradles of chestnut wood that keep their round bellies clear of the damp floor. The barrels are not all the same size. Some hold as much as 100 gallons and stand nearly as tall as your chest, while others are smaller casks that might be lifted by two strong men and carried to the house when the cider is ready to drink. Their surfaces are darkened with age and use, the wood grain showing as a fine script of alternating light and shadow lines that run the length of each stave, and where the iron hoops grip them, the oak has been compressed into shiny, dark rings that look almost polished. You can smell the barrels before you touch them, a scent that lives in the cellar as a permanent resident. A blend of old oak, the memory of apples, the faint metallic tang of iron, and something deeper that is simply the fragrance of slow, patient containment. Each barrel is stoppered with a bung of hardwood wrapped in a scrap of clean linen, and near each bung someone, perhaps your father or your grandfather, has scratched a small mark with the point of a nail, a figure denoting the pressing day, a letter for the orchard field, and a simple cross or circle that indicates whether the cider within is sweet, bitter, or blended. These marks are done without flourish, a quiet accounting that needs no words, and they run along the barrel heads in faded lines that you can decipher with a glance. The newest barrel, only just filled a week ago, still wears a small garland of dried apple blossom that your younger sister tied around its bung as a playful blessing, and the flowers have curled into brown, papery knots that release a faint, honeyed whisper when the lantern warmth draws near. You walk the length of the center aisle slowly, your fingers trailing from barrel to barrel without purpose, simply noting the coolness of each in turn. Some of the older casks feel stone cold to the touch, their contents having long ago finished any active fermentation and settled into a deep, clear sleep that will not be disturbed until the tapping mallet finds its bung. The younger barrels are faintly warmer, a subtle difference you notice only because you have known this cellar since your hands were small enough to fit into the sump channel. And that fractional warmth is the quiet signature of yeast still at its final, lazy work, releasing the last of its sugar-scented breath into the headspace above the cider. If you press your ear against the oak, and you do, because you always do, you can hear a sound so small it might be imagined. A single soft bloop, not unlike a fish rising to take a mayfly from a pond surface, then a long silence, then another, spaced so far apart that counting the seconds becomes a meditation. You hold your breath without meaning to, and in that held stillness the cellar offers up its full register of smaller sounds. Somewhere to your left, behind a stack of empty casks, a field mouse is making its careful way through a nest of straw fragments. Each rustle so tiny it registers only as a change in the texture of the quiet. Overhead, the house above transmits a muffled, low-frequency settling, a single floorboard adjusting to the shift of weight from a chair being drawn close to the hearth, and the sound travels down through the stone and the oak beams as a vibration more felt than heard. A gentle thrum that passes through the soles of your feet and fades. The lantern makes a faint, continuous hiss as the flame consumes the oil, a sound as steady as breathing, and the wick occasionally spits a tiny spark that dies before it can reach the hornpane, blinking out in a momentary bright dot. The cellar is a place where time does not hurry, and it has taught you to match its pace. You find yourself standing entirely still beside the first of the larger barrels, your hand resting lightly on its chime, the raised rim where the staves extend just past the barrel head. The wood there is smooth and slightly rounded by the plane of the cooper, and your thumb traces a small knot in the grain. A dark whorl that feels warmer than the surrounding oak only because it is denser, holding the memory of a branch that once grew in a different direction. You know this knot, the way you know the crack in the third step of the house stairs, without thinking about it. And the familiarity is a comfort so deep it hardly registers as feeling. Above the barrels, tucked into the space where the curved wall meets the beams, you have placed a row of small stones that your children collected from the stream, and they sit there still in their order of size, grey and white, and one with a stripe of pink quartz that glints only when the lantern flame bends in a draught. The draught is minimal, a movement of air that comes from a small ventilation slit high in the gable wall, a narrow opening shuttered with a piece of slate that can be slid aside with a hooked stick. It is open a crack today, enough to let the cellar breathe without letting in the warming air, and the faint current passes through the room with the impartiality of water through a gentle riffle, touching everything equally and disturbing nothing. You feel it on your cheek now as you tilt your head to listen, a ghost of freshness that carries no scent of outside beyond a hint of wet stone. The lantern light lays a soft geometry across the floor, painting the cradles as dark, elongated shadows that stretch toward the sump channel and stop just before touching it, as if the darkness respects a boundary. Within that pall of light, dust motes drift in a slow, vertical dance, so fine they are visible only when they pass through the brightest center of the beam. And they move without urgency, rising and falling on currents too subtle to name. Watching them is like watching the slow drift of clouds from a hillside, a motion so gradual that you lose it if you focus too hard, only noticing the change when you look away and look back to find everything reconfigured. The motes are fragments of chaff from the pressing, bits of dried apple skin, specks of clay, all suspended in the cool, dense air that keeps them aloft far longer than the air upstairs ever could. You think about the apples, not as a memory of labor, but as a knowledge that rests in you, a knowledge of the orchard's 200 trees and their particular habits, the bitter varieties with their small hard fruits and astringent skins that pucker the mouth, growing on the higher slope where the soil thins over chalk, the sweets, yellow and soft-fleshed, clustered near the stream where the ground is deeper, and the roots can drink their fill, the sharps which are neither sweet nor bitter, but carry a clean, knife-edged tartness, planted along the stone wall that separates your farm from the lane. All of them were gathered in canvas slings, bruised and spotted, and some with the tiny brown tunnels of worms, and all of them now rest transformed in the barrels around you, their names dissolved into the general name of cider, their individualities merged into a blend that is greater than any single fruit. This thought passes through you without weight, a slow drift like the dust motes, and you let it go. Your gaze moves to the tool rack fixed to the short wall beside the steps, where the siphon and the mallet and the clean linen cloths hang in their accustomed order. They wait with the stillness of objects that have done their work and will do it again, and nothing about them suggests urgency. The copper racking cane gleams dully where it catches the light, its curve a perfect quarter circle that will fit neatly into the bunghole and descend to just above the layer of lees. Beside it, the wooden mallet's head is wrapped in a sleeve of leather stitched with twine, a cover meant to muffle the sound when it strikes the bung, for loud noises feel out of place in this underground room, and you have always preferred a quiet tap, a gentle persuasion rather than force. Below the cane, a coil of hose made from bleached linen lies in a neat loop, its end tied with a slipknot to keep it from uncoiling, and the pail that will catch the first cloudy run of cider hangs from a wooden peg polished dark by the friction of its handle. You move to these tools and touch each one lightly, a greeting without words, though you will not use them for a little while yet. Today's work is simple and can begin whenever you are ready, which is another way of saying that it has no fixed starting time, no bell to ring it into being. The racking will happen when the stillness of the cellar has fully entered you, when your breathing has slowed to match the slow respiration of the barrels, and that moment is not yet. You know with a certainty that needs no examination that the cider will wait, that it has been waiting for weeks in the dark and will not sour if you stand here for another quarter hour simply being still. You find yourself beside the old barrel, the one your grandfather made when he was younger than you are now, its staves darkened to a deep mahogany, and its hoops pitted with a fine rust that powders orange when you rub it. This barrel always holds the first blend of the season, a mix of the earliest bitter apples and the late sweets that ripen after the first frost. And its cider will be the one you open at the harvest supper next year, when the new pressing is done and the workers gather in the yard. You place both palms on its curved side, feeling the shape of it, the slight outward bulge that holds the pressure of liquid, and the inward curve at the head where the staves meet, the circular groove. The wood is cool but not cold, a temperature that seems to match exactly the temperature of your own skin, as if over the years the barrel has learned you, and you have learned it. You stand there for a long, slow count of breaths, feeling the cellar's quiet gather around you like a blanket tucked at the edges. And when you finally lift your hands and turn back toward the steps to fetch the clean linen, you do so without any sense of having delayed anything important. The cool breath of the cellar follows you up the first 3 steps, then gradually subsides as the warmer air of the house reaches down to meet it. And at the threshold where the lantern light begins to mingle with the grey daylight from the kitchen door, you pause and look back one last time. The barrels sit in their rows, silent and patient, their round shadows overlapping on the clay floor, and the flame in the lantern you have left on the shelf continues its slow, even burn, drawing the oil up through the wick with a constancy that will not falter for hours yet. The cellar is as it always has been, a chamber of waiting, a lung filled with cool air, a place where the year's harvest rests in darkness and slowly, imperceptibly, becomes something more than it was. You step up into the light and the coolness withdraws, but it remains on your skin as a gentle memory, a promise of the work still to come, unhurried and sure. In the farthest corner of the cellar, where the lantern light softens to a suggestion and the shadows gather like old dust, a large shape rests beneath a sheet of heavy linen. The sheet is the color of unbleached wool, a pale oat gray that has darkened over the years along its fold lines to a deeper, muted brown. It drapes from a high point at the center and cascades down in stiff, angled planes that reveal the geometry of what lies beneath. A tall vertical beam, a broad horizontal bed, a heavy crosspiece, and the thick dark thread of an iron screw rising through the middle like the trunk of a tree grown indoors. The linen holds the stillness of months, unmoved since the last pressing day, and a fine skin of cellar dust has settled into its weave, softening its contours so that the press appears less an object and more a feature of the cellar itself, a sleeping creature of wood and iron wrapped in a blanket of quiet. You approach it without purpose, drawn by the same instinct that leads your hand to touch the barrels as you pass, the quiet wish to acknowledge something that has worked faithfully and now rests. The packed earth beneath your shoes is slightly uneven here, sloping toward the sump channel, and you step carefully around a small depression where the weight of the press has settled the clay into a shallow, permanent bowl. The press has stood in this corner for longer than you have been alive, built by your great-grandfather from a beech tree that once grew beside the stream, and it has crushed a lifetime of apples without ever being moved more than a handspan from its original position. To shift it would require the strength of 4 men and the disassembly of its heaviest timbers, and no one has ever seen a reason to do so, for the press has found its home, and the home has shaped itself around the press. You lift the edge of the linen sheet carefully, folding it back over the highest point so that the beam beneath is slowly revealed. The great beechwood screw emerges first, a vertical column as thick as your thigh, its surface carved with deep square threads that spiral upward from the press bed to the crossbeam. The threads are dark with age and friction, but along their crests you can still see a faint gleam where they have been polished by the repeated passage of the wooden nut that once turned against them, and the faint smell of lard still clings to the wood, a clean, fatty scent that mingles with the general perfume of the cellar. The lard was applied last September, rubbed into the threads with a scrap of linen until they gleamed, and though it has dried now to a waxy residue that attracts dust in tiny grey speckles, its purpose remains visible in the smooth surfaces that once allowed the screw to turn with a slow, groaning ease. Below the screw, the press bed spreads out in a generous rectangle of oak planks, their edges joined so tightly that even after decades of swelling and shrinking with the seasons, no light passes between them. The bed is stained a deep amber brown, the color of dried apple juice soaked into wood fiber and oxidized by air, and the stain is not uniform but mottled, darker in the center where the pressing cheeses were stacked, and lighter at the edges where the juice ran off into the collection channel. That channel is a groove carved around the perimeter of the bed, leading to a small spout that once directed the flow into waiting tubs, and if you run your finger along its curve, you will feel the minute ridges left by the carpenter's gouge, a series of parallel striations that have been worn smooth except at the very deepest point where the tool once hesitated. The pressing cloths are folded on a shelf beside the press, a stack of heavy, woven hemp squares each roughly the size of a cartwheel. They are stiff now with residual apple pulp that dried into a brittle, crystalline crust, and they crackle faintly when you lift the topmost cloth, releasing a puff of scent that is sharply sweet and faintly fermented, the ghost of fruit that once filled them. These cloths were cleaned as well as cold water and scrubbing could manage, but the fibers have a memory, and the stain of tannin has dyed them a permanent ruddy brown that will never wash out. They wait in their stack, one atop the other, the edges aligned with a precision that speaks of the careful hands that put them away, and between each cloth a thin layer of rye straw was pressed in September to keep the layers separate and allow the juice to escape, and a few pale strands still cling to the hempen weave, brittle and gold. Beside the cloths, the stone mill sits silent under its own cloth cover, a round trough of granite with a heavy grinding wheel that once turned on a vertical axle, crushing the apples into a coarse pomace before they ever reached the press. The wheel is visible at its edge, a grey curve shot through with flecks of mica that glint in the lantern light, and though it has been scrubbed clean of pulp, the faint, fruity smell of dried apple still rises from the porous stone. The wooden handle that turned it is propped against the wall, a long pole of ash polished smooth in the middle where hands gripped it, and the iron pivot at its end is wrapped in an oily rag to keep rust at bay. No one has touched that handle in weeks, and no one will until next autumn, yet it stands ready, waiting in its corner with a patience that mirrors the press's own. You let your gaze travel over these objects with a slowness that matches the stillness of the room, and as you do, the memory of the pressing day rises not as a vivid picture, but as a quiet knowledge, a series of facts that live in you without urgency. The apples were gathered on a morning that smelled of sun-warmed grass and the faint, dusty bitterness of yellowing leaves. They were heaped into wicker baskets that creaked under the weight, the sweet varieties from the lower orchard mingling with the sharp green fruits from the wall, and the small, bitter apples from the chalk slope, each variety adding its necessary character to the blend. You recall the sound of the baskets being tipped into the stone mill's hopper, the dull thud of apples tumbling onto apples, and the first grinding resistance as the wheel began to turn, crushing the fruit into a wet, fragrant mass that released its juice in sudden, bright drops on the granite. The pomace, once ground, was carried in wooden buckets to the pressbed, where a layer of clean rye straw had been spread to form a drainage mat. You remember the way the straw crackled when the first scoop of pulp was laid upon it, the wetness darkening the golden stalks, and the careful hands that folded the straw over the pomace to create a neat, square package called a cheese. Then another straw layer, another spread of pulp, another fold, building a stack that rose slowly until it reached the height of the screw's lower plate. The stack of cheeses stood there, like a small, fragrant tower, its sides weeping a thin, pinkish juice that dripped into the channel and found its way to the spout, and the whole cellar filled with the sharp, sweet, living scent of crushed fruit, so intense it seemed to vibrate in the air. The turning of the screw began gently, a few slow rotations that pressed the upper beam down onto the stack, with a creak that travelled through the timbers and into the floor. As the pressure increased, the juice ran faster, a steady amber stream that poured from the spout into the waiting oaken tub, carrying with it bits of straw and a fine, suspended cloud of apple solids that would later settle into lees. The men at the handle leaned into their work, their sleeves rolled above their elbows, their faces expressionless with concentration, and the sound of the turning screw was a deep, rhythmic groan, punctuated by the occasional crackle of straw compressing under tons of slow, steady force. The tubs filled one by one, and the cheeses shrank to a fraction of their former height, the pulp inside them pressed into dry, fibrous cakes that would later be fed to the pigs or spread on the garden. Nothing wasted. That day is gone now, dissolved back into the calendar of seasons where it waits with all the other pressing days of years past, indistinguishable from them in everything except the particular pattern of sunlight on the cellar steps and the names of the children who ran between the baskets. The press itself remembers nothing, yet it holds the shape of that labor in its stained wood and its greased threads, and the slight, permanent lean of its upright beam, which has settled over decades to a 1/4-degree tilt toward the eastern wall. You place your hand on that beam now, feeling the cool, dense weight of the beech, a wood so hard that the iron nails of the house frame could not penetrate it if they tried. The surface is smooth under your palm, finished by the hands of a man you never knew, and in that smoothness there is a continuity that needs no words. The lantern on its stone shelf flickers once, a momentary dip in the flame caused by some subtle shift in the oil level, and then it steadies again, its light falling on the dust motes that drift around the press in slow, vertical currents. These motes are the smallest fragments of last year's work. Dried flecks of apple skin and straw and cellar dirt that were stirred up when the linen sheet was folded back, and they move now in a dance so slow it takes a patient eye to follow it. One mote rises almost to the ceiling beam before it stalls, hesitates, and begins a gradual descent, its path describing a gentle invisible loop that intersects with the paths of other motes without ever colliding. Watching them is like watching the slow drift of a river seen from a great height, a movement so gradual that it registers only as a change between one moment and the next, a quiet reconfiguration of the air itself. You draw the linen sheet back over the press, letting it fall in the same folds it held before, and the dust motes settle onto its surface, a fresh coat of time that will thicken imperceptibly over the months until next autumn's pressing day stirs them up again. The press returns to its shrouded state, a silhouette of angles under grey cloth, and the corner resumes its accustomed stillness. The stone mill, the pressing cloths, the ash handle all wait in their places, and they will wait through the winter and the spring and the long summer with the same patience they have always shown, asking for nothing but the return of the apples and the hands that know how to tend them. You turn away and the lantern light follows you across the floor, leaving the press in a darkness that is not an absence but a presence, a gentle nothing that fills the space under the linen and around the stacked cloths with a quiet so complete it feels almost solid. The cellar breathes its cruel, slow breath, and the screw, the beam, the bed, and the channel all rest in that breathing, held in suspension until the wheel of the year brings the next harvest and the first basket of apples tips its burden into the stone trough. Until then, the press will not move, and the silence it keeps is the deepest silence in the cellar, a silence made of waiting, of work completed, of the long, slow rhythm that turns apples into cider and days into years. You step toward the center aisle where the barrels stand in their rows, and the weight of that silence travels with you, a calm companion as steady and quiet as the flame in the lantern that needs no tending. The morning in the cellar has no beginning, no moment when stillness tips into motion, for the transition comes in the same slow way that the mist outside has brightened from grey to silver, without any single instant of change. You find yourself standing near the tool rack on the short wall beside the steps, and you understand without having made any conscious decision that the time for preparation has arrived, a quiet readiness that has been building since you first descended the worn stone steps and felt the cool breath of the earth settle around your shoulders. The lantern on its stone shelf continues its steady, silent burn, casting that familiar teardrop of yellow light over the packed clay floor and the rows of oak barrels, and in that light the tools on their hooks and pegs wait with the patience of objects that have been handled by generations of hands and will be handled again, each one carrying its own small history in the polish of its surface and the wear of its edges. You step toward the rack, your wooden shoes making that soft, muffled thud on the clay that sounds less like a footstep and more like a heartbeat, shared with the floor itself. The rack is a simple construction of two upright chestnut posts driven into the wall, with a crosspiece of the same wood pegged between them, and from this crosspiece a series of iron hooks and wooden pegs extend outward at measured intervals, each one holding a different tool needed for the work of the cellar. The iron is dark with age, a matte black that has never seen rust because the cool, dry air of the underground room preserves metal as carefully as it preserves cider, a fortune of dryness in a place that seems perpetually damp but is in fact only cool. The moisture on the stones, a surface condensation that never penetrates the tools. The wooden pegs are worn into smooth ovals where friction has polished them, and they gleam faintly with the same low light that catches the curve of the copper cane hanging on its own special hook. A hook that was bent to shape by the blacksmith in the village at the request of your father, who wanted the cane always within easy reach and always returning to the same place. The copper racking cane is the first object you lift, and your hands knows its weight before your mind names it. The cane is a length of pure copper tubing, longer than your arm from shoulder to fingertip, bent at one end into a gentle quarter-circle curve that will later fit snugly into the bunhole of the full barrel, and the curve is not a sharp angle, but a gradual sweep that the coppersmith formed by heating the metal and bending it around a wooden jig. a process you once watched as a child in the village smithy with the red glow of the forge reflecting in your wide eyes. The surface of the copper is a living thing, marked by years of cider and air and the oils of human skin. A patina that shifts from a deep, rosy gold along the straight shaft to a soft, mossy green where the acidic juice has most often touched, especially around the lip of the curved end that dips into the liquid. No one has ever scrubbed this patina away, for it is not dirt, but a protective layer that forms naturally on copper left in peace, and it smells faintly metallic when you bring the cane close to your face, a clean, cool scent like a penny held in a child's palm after a rain. You hold the cane loosely in both hands, feeling its slight heft, the way it balances just ahead of the curve, so that it tilts forward if you let it. The copper is cool from hanging in the cellar air, and its temperature seeps into your palms with a sensation that is not cold enough to call cold, merely a gentle reminder of the metal's nature, a nature that will soon warm slightly as it carries the room temperature cider from barrel to barrel. You run a thumb along the shaft, tracing a faint ring that marks the spot where the cooper's hands once gripped it during a previous racking, and that ring is slightly smoother than the surrounding metal, burnished by repeated friction into a subtle, silky band. The inside of the cane is dark, a mysterious hollow that you cannot see into, but you know it is clean because it was rinsed with boiling water after the last use and hung upside down to drain, and a single drop of water still clings to the inner lip, trembling in the lantern light before you tilt the cane and let it fall onto the clay floor with a tiny dark splat. Beside the copper cane, a length of clean linen hose hangs in a neat coil looped over a wooden peg. The hose is as important as the cane, for it will carry the cider from the lower end of the siphon into the waiting pail, and it has been made by your wife's hands from the same linen that clothes the family, woven tight and sewn into a tube with a double seam that has never leaked. The linen is the color of pale cream, bleached by repeated boiling in a cauldron of water with a handful of wood ash to whiten it, and after each boiling it was stretched on a frame to dry in the sun of the yard until it stiffened into a smooth, firm cylinder. You lift the coil from its peg and feel the texture of the fabric under your fingers, a slight, pleasant roughness that comes from the flax fibers, a roughness that softens when wet, and the hose smells of the herbs that were boiled with it the last time it was cleaned. A faint, lingering hint of rosemary and bay that still clings to the weave despite months of hanging in the cellar. The coil is secured with a slipknot of twine that you loosen with a single pull, and the hose uncurls in your hands with a soft, whispering rustle. Its natural shape, a series of loose, open rings that will straighten when the cider begins to flow through it. You drape the linen hose over your shoulder, where it rests with a light, dry weight against the wool of your vest, and you turn next to the small oaken pail that hangs by its handle from a hook near the bottom of the rack. The pail is a miniature of the great barrels, built by the same cooper who made the larger casks, its staves bound by 3 narrow iron bands that have been blackened with linseed oil to keep them from rusting, and its handle is a curved strip of ashwood that has been worn into a dark, glossy patina by the grip of many hands over many years. The pail holds perhaps 2 gallons, no more, and its purpose today is to catch the cider as it siphons from the hose so that you can carry it in small, manageable amounts to the clean barrel, pouring it carefully through a cloth-lined funnel to catch any stray particles of sediment that might have been stirred despite your care. The inside of the pail is stained a deep, reddish amber from countless fillings, and when you tilt it toward the lantern, the light catches the faint concentric rings left by the cider's surface as it dried, layer by layer, a record of past seasons written in tannin on wood. The pail is light in your hand, its dry wood so light it feels almost hollow, and the handle creaks faintly when you grip it, a tiny familiar sound that has accompanied every racking you have ever done. You gather these 3 objects, the cane in one hand like a shepherd's crook, the hose draped over your shoulder, the pail swinging gently from your other hand, and you turn away from the rack to cross the cellar floor toward the space where the new barrel waits, a space you have already cleared in your mind, though you have not yet moved a single cask. The walk is short, no more than a dozen paces, but you take it slowly because there is no reason to hurry, and the rhythm of your footsteps on the clay is a steady, unhurried beat that matches the slow pulse of the lantern flame behind you. The pail taps lightly against your leg with each step, a soft wooden knock that is barely audible over the general hush of the cellar, and the linen hose shifts on your shoulder with a gentle swish that sounds like a field mouse moving through dry straw. You set the cane and the pail down on the floor beside an empty cask that rests on a low chestnut cradle, a cradle that you placed here yesterday afternoon in a moment of foresight, knowing that this day would come and that the work would be easier if everything was ready in its place. The cradle is a simple affair of two curved wooden supports joined by a crossbar, its surface worn smooth by decades of use, and it holds the empty barrel at a slight angle, tilted just enough that the bunghole faces slightly upward, a position that will make the filling easier and reduce the chance of splashing. The empty barrel itself is one of the smaller ones, a cask that will hold perhaps 30 gallons, and it was made only 2 years ago by the cooper in the village, a man whose name you know, but whose work speaks louder than any name. The oak of this barrel is still relatively pale, a warm honey color that has not yet darkened to the deep mahogany of the older casks, and its surface is smooth and clean, the staves fitting together so precisely that no light escapes through the joints. The iron hoops are painted with a thin coat of red lead to protect them from the damp, and the paint is dulled over time to a dusty, brick-colored matte that peels in a few places, revealing the dark, oily metal beneath. The bunghole is a perfect circle bored into the topmost stave, its edges slightly beveled to accept the tapered bung, and currently it is stoppered, with a temporary plug of softwood wrapped in a scrap of linen to keep out dust and insects while the barrel waited its turn. You reach down and pull this temporary plug with a gentle twist, and it comes free with a soft, popping sound that releases a puff of air from inside the barrel, air that smells of fresh, dry oak and the faint, sweet ghost of the steam that was used to bend the staves during the barrel's construction. The interior of the barrel is dark and clean, its surface a pale, smooth wood that has never known cider, and the smell that rises from the bunghole is so clean it reminds you of the scent of a new wooden chest opened for the first time. You set the temporary plug aside and reach for the proper bung, a tapered stopper of birchwood that has been carved to fit this barrel exactly, and you test its fit by pressing it gently into the hole, turning it slightly until it seats with a firm, even pressure all around its circumference. The fit is snug but not tight, leaving enough room that you will be able to tap it loose with the mallet when the barrel is full and needs to be sealed for aging, and you are satisfied with this small check, a detail that requires only a moment of attention, yet carries the weight of all the cider that will rest behind it. The wooden mallet that you will use for that tapping rests now on the floor beside the cradle, placed there earlier when you first began gathering the tools, and you glance down at it as you straighten from examining the bung. The mallet is a simple tool, a cylinder of ash wood with a slightly bulbous head, and its striking face is wrapped in several layers of soft leather stitched into a tight cap with waxed linen thread. The leather is dark brown and polished from use, its surface marked by a faint cross-hatched pattern of tiny cracks that speak of age and repeated blows, though those blows have always been gentle, the mallet's purpose being to persuade rather than to force. The handle is smooth and fits your palm with an easy familiarity, its end slightly flared to prevent slipping, and a small hole has been drilled through the handle to accept a loop of rawhide that you sometimes hang from a hook on the rack, though today you have not bothered. The mallet's weight is modest, its balance such that it rises and falls with little effort, and the leather wrapping mutes its sound so that when it strikes the bung, the noise will be a soft, cushioned thump, barely louder than a handclap, a sound that will not disturb the sleeping barrels or the quiet of the cellar. You leave the mallet where it lies, for there is no need to move it yet, and you turn your attention back to the copper cane that rests against the cradle, its curved end pointing upward like the neck of a resting swan. You lift it again and inspect the end that will be inserted into the full barrel, checking for any small obstructions in the opening, any bit of lint or cellar dust that might have found its way inside during the months of hanging. The opening is clear, a dark, round mouth that you can feel with the tip of your smallest finger, smooth and cool inside, and you blow gently across it, a soft, brief puff of breath that produces a faint, hollow whistle. A sound so quiet, it barely reaches your own ears before it is absorbed into the thick, still air of the cellar. Satisfied, You set the cane down again and pick up the linen hose, running its length through your fingers to ensure there are no twists or kinks. Feeling the tight, even weave and the slight frayed softness at the cut ends where the fabric has been trimmed. The hose is ready, and you attach one end of it to the straight outlet of the copper cane by slipping it over the tube, the fit snug enough to hold without any cord or plump. A simple friction connection that has been tested by years of use and has never failed. With the cane and hose assembled and the pail waiting, you pause for a moment and let the stillness of the cellar settle around you once more. The air carries the quiet promise of the work ahead, a work that requires no hurry and no force, only the steady, patient movement of your hands and the slow, rhythmic pouring of cider from one vessel to another. The barrels in their rows seem to watch without watching, their round, dark faces impassive and calm, and the lantern continues its steady burn, its flame as constant as a star seen through a high window. You breathe in the cool earthen air, feel the weight of the day above you resting lightly on the stone ceiling, and you know that everything is ready, that the tools are in their places and the barrel is in its cradle, and the work will begin when you choose to begin it, not a moment before. The cellar holds its breath, and you hold yours with it, and in that shared suspension the morning continues its slow, silent turning, carrying the world toward the moment when the first amber drop of cider will fall from the hose into the pail, with a sound like a single, perfect note of quiet music. The full barrel stands before you on its chestnut cradle, the one you selected from the row against the eastern wall, a cask that was filled 6 weeks ago with the first blend of the season, a mix of the small bitter apples from the chalk slope and the yellow sweets from the lower orchard. Its surface is dark with age, the oak a deep weathered brown that has absorbed decades of cellar air and spilled cider, and the faint, oily residue of human hands checking its temperature on cold winter mornings. The iron hoops are tight, their edges slightly rusted where the red lead paint has flaked away over the years. But the rust is only a surface bloom, a fine orange powder that leaves a faint stain on your fingertip when you brush it. And the hoops themselves are sound, gripping the staves with the same pressure they have maintained since the cooper first hammered them into place with his long steel driver and his wooden mallet. The bung is seated firmly in its hole at the top of the barrel, a tapered plug of birchwood wrapped in a thin scrap of clean linen, and it has not been disturbed since the day the barrel was filled and stoppered, the cider inside left to ferment and settle in the cool, constant darkness. Before you disturb this bung, before you insert the curved end of the copper racking cane and begin the slow work of siphoning, you pause and reach for a different tool, a long wooden pipette that hangs from a small leather loop on the side of the tool rack, overlooked until now but essential in its own quiet way. The pipette is no thicker than your smallest finger, its shaft straight and true, its surface darkened by years of cider and careful handling to a deep, ruddy amber that is almost the color of the liquid it was made to sample. It was carved from a single piece of straight-grained willow by your own hands on a winter evening many years ago, whittled slowly by the fire while the wind moved around the chimney pots and the children slept in the loft. And you remember the way the pale white wood peeled away in long curling shavings that drifted down onto the hearthstones and were consumed by the embers with a brief bright crackle. The pipette is hollow, bored through its center with a long thin auger that required a steady hand and much patience, for willow splits easily if the tool wavers, and the hole is narrow enough that it fills with cider only when the pipette is dipped into a barrel and you close the top end with your thumb, trapping a column of liquid inside that can be lifted out and released into a waiting cup. The top end is rounded and smooth, polished by the repeated pressure of your thumb, and the lower end is cut at a slight angle to make it easier to pierce the surface of the cider without disturbing the sediment below. You take a small wooden cup from the shelf, a cup turned from a block of applewood that came from a tree that stood in the far corner of the orchard until a winter storm split its trunk, and the cup has a simple, pleasing shape, wider at the brim than at the base, its sides marked with the concentric rings left by the turner's chisel, rings that spiral gently upward from the foot to the lip. The wood is a pale honeyed brown, lighter than the barrel oak, and it has been oiled with walnut oil to keep it from cracking, a treatment that gives it a soft, faintly nutty scent that mingles with the general perfume of the cellar. The cup holds perhaps a gill, no more, enough for a single considered taste, and its rim is worn smooth from years of use, a tiny, almost invisible bevel, where lips have touched it on 100 tasting days. You carry the pipette and the cup to the full barrel and set the cup down on the flat head of the cask, where it rests with a soft wooden tap that is barely audible over the quiet hiss of the lantern. The bung requires only a gentle twist to loosen, for it was not hammered in, but simply seated with the pressure of a hand, a temporary closure meant to keep out dust and insects while allowing the fermentation gases to escape through the tiny gaps around its circumference, and it comes free with a soft sucking sound that releases a puff of air from inside the barrel. That air has been trapped in the headspace above the cider for weeks, and it carries a scent that rises to meet you as you lean forward. A scent that is sharp and fruity and faintly yeasty, the breath of millions of tiny organisms that have lived and multiplied and died in the sweet darkness, converting sugar into alcohol and releasing their quiet, invisible gases with a patience that matches the cellar's own. You set the bung aside on a clean scrap of linen that you spread on the barrel head for this purpose, and you lean forward to look into the bunghole. Though there is little to see in the darkness beyond a faint, glimmering reflection that moves as your head moves, the surface of the cider catching the lantern light from behind you and throwing it back as a broken, golden glint. The hole is perhaps 2 inches across, a dark circle that seems to contain an entire world in its depths. And for a moment you simply stand there with your hands resting on the curved staves, breathing in the scent of the young cider and feeling the quiet anticipation of the first taste. A taste that will tell you whether the fermentation is complete, and the lees have settled and the cider is ready to be racked. You take the willow pipette in your right hand, holding it lightly between your thumb and first 2 fingers, and you lower it slowly into the bunghole, letting it descend through the darkness until you feel the slight, liquid resistance that tells you the angled tip has pierced the surface. The cider is cool, a temperature that transmits itself up through the thin wood and into your fingertips, and you feel the subtle change as the pipette slides deeper, passing through the clear liquid above the sediment layer and approaching the place where the lees lie thick and cloudy on the bottom curve of the barrel. You stop before you reach that layer, drawing the pipette back up a handspan so that it rests in the clearest part of the cider, the part that has been settling for weeks and is now as translucent as amber, held up to a candle. You press your thumb firmly over the top hole of the pipette, sealing it, and then you lift the pipette slowly out of the barrel, a column of cider, trapped inside by the pressure of the air above it, a simple trick of physics that has been known to every cider maker since the first apples were pressed in the orchards of the Pays d'Ange. The pipette emerges from the bunghole with a single amber drop clinging to its angled tip, a drop that trembles for a moment in the lantern light and then falls back into the barrel with a sound so small it is more a visual event than an audible one. A tiny circular ripple that spreads across the surface and fades before you can draw your next breath. You carry the filled pipette to the wooden cup, holding it upright so that the column of cider does not escape, and when the tip is poised just above the cup's center, you lift your thumb from the top hole with a gentle, deliberate motion. The cider releases at once, flowing from the pipette in a thin amber stream that arcs downward into the cup with a soft, musical trickle, a sound that belongs to the tasting ritual and has been heard in this cellar 1,000 times, each time the same and each time subtly different depending on the vintage and the blend and the particular chemistry of that year's apples. The cup fills to a depth of perhaps 2 fingers, enough to examine and smell and taste, and you set the pipette aside on the clean linen beside the bung. A single drop of residual cider, still clinging to its inner bore and darkening the pale wood at the tip. You lift the cup with both hands, cradling it as if it contains something precious, which it does, for the cider in this cup is the sum of an entire year's labor and weather and waiting, the sun of June and the rain of August and the first frost of October, all transformed by yeast and time into a liquid that holds the memory of the orchard in its pale amber depths. You hold the cup up to the lantern, tilting it slightly so that the light passes through the cider and illuminates it from within. The color is the first thing you note, a pale golden amber that is lighter than honey and darker than straw, a color that seems to glow with its own internal warmth. The cider is not perfectly clear, for it is young yet and still carries a faint, cloudy haze of suspended yeast, a haze that drifts in slow, gentle swirls when you turn the cup, and those swirls catch the light and reveal tiny particles that are too small to name, the last lazy remnants of the fermentation that will continue to settle over the coming months, until the cider is as bright as a bell. The haze is a good sign, for it means the yeast has not been rushed, that it is still gently active, still working its last patient transformation in the cool darkness of the barrel, and the sight of it reassures you the way the sight of a sleeping child reassures a parent, a quiet confirmation that all is as it should be. You tilt the cup in the other direction and watch the way the cider clings to the wood, leaving a thin viscous film that runs down the inner curve in slow, parallel legs, each leg separating from the next and then merging again as the liquid settles back into stillness. The cider has body, a certain weight and texture that speaks of the bitter apples from the chalk slope, whose tannins give the liquid a gentle astringency, a slight grip on the tongue that will soften with age, and the sweet apples from the lower orchard, whose sugars have been converted into alcohol, but whose essence remains as a round, mellow presence that balances the bitterness and gives the finish a lingering, honeyed warmth. These qualities are visible already in the way the cider moves, the way it sheets on the cup surface, the way the tiny bubbles cling to the rim and refuse to burst, holding their shape for long, slow seconds before they dissolve back into the liquid with a gentle, silent sigh. You bring the cup to your nose and inhale slowly, letting the scent unfold in its own time without trying to force it into words or categories. The first layer is the sharp, clean smell of green apple peel, a bright, high note that rises from the cup like the top note of a perfume. And beneath that, there is something deeper and more complex. The smell of wet stone after a summer rain, a smell that comes from the limestone soil where the bitter apples grow and that has been carried into the cider through the roots of the trees and the flesh of the fruit. There is a whisper of barn straw, a clean, dusty sweetness that reminds you of the pressing day when the straw was laid between the pomace cheeses and the juice ran through it, picking up a faint golden fragrance that has persisted all through the fermentation. And under all of these, like a bass note in a piece of quiet music, there is the cool, clean smell of spring water, a smell that is almost the absence of smell, a purity that speaks of the deep well from which the water was drawn to wash the apples and the cloths and the tools, a water that has filtered through chalk and sand for 100 years before it reached the bucket and was carried to the press. The scent changes as the cider warms slightly in your hands, releasing new notes that were hidden in the coolness, a hint of bruised fruit that is not unpleasant, but rather soft and mellow, the ghost of apples that fell from the tree before they were gathered and lay in the dewy grass for a morning, their skins dimpled and soft. There is a faint, nutty quality that comes from the oak of the barrel itself, a vanilla-like sweetness that the wood has imparted to the cider during the weeks of fermentation, and this note will grow stronger over the months and years of aging, layering itself into the liquid until it becomes a permanent part of its character. The scent is rich but not heavy, complex but not demanding, a quiet, layered fragrance that invites you to breathe deeper and hold the breath, letting the perfume fill your senses and then fade slowly as you exhale, leaving behind only the faintest trace of apple blossom, a ghost of the spring that gave birth to the autumn fruit. At last, when the scent has told you everything it can, you lift the cup to your lips and taste. The first sip is small, barely enough to wet your tongue, for the tasting is not about drinking, but about knowing, and you let the cider rest in your mouth for a moment, moving it across your tongue and into the pockets of your cheeks before you swallow. The first impression is of dryness, a clean, sharp dryness that comes from the complete fermentation of the sugars, leaving behind a cider that is not sweet but crisp, its edges defined by the tannins of the bitter apples that give it structure and the acids of the sharp apples that give it length. The dryness is not harsh or unpleasant. It is a gentle, clean dryness that makes the mouth feel fresh and cool, as if you had bitten into a firm green apple on a warm day and felt the juice tighten the skin of your gums. Then, as the cider moves to the back of your tongue, the faint sweetness of the sweet apples makes itself known, not as a sugary taste but as a roundness, a softening of the edges, a gentle warmth that fills in the spaces between the tannin and the acid, and gives the cider a completeness that would be lacking without it. The sweetness is a memory more than a flavor, the echo of sugar that has been transformed into something more subtle, and it lingers in the finish like the last note of a song held softly in the air after the singer has stopped. The wild yeasts that fermented the cider have left their own small signature, a faint bready tang, A whisper of the farmhouse kitchen where the bread dough rises in its wooden trough beside the hearth, and this tang gives the cider a depth that speaks of the place it was made, a specific farmhouse in a specific valley, with its own particular population of yeasts that have lived on the apples and the walls for as long as anyone can remember. The earthy finish comes last, rising slowly from the back of your throat as you swallow, a taste of the Normandy soil itself, the chalk and clay and flint that make up the bones of the orchard, and this earthiness is the foundation upon which all the other flavors rest, a base note so deep it is felt rather than tasted, a grounding presence that connects the cider to the land and the land to the drinker. You take a second sip, larger this time, and the flavors repeat themselves with the same slow, orderly progression, dry, then round, then earthy, a quiet litany of taste that is as familiar as the sound of rain on the roof or the creak of the cellar door, and with each sip you confirm what the first sip suggested, which is that the fermentation is complete and the lees have settled and the cider is ready to be racked. You lower the cup and let the last few drops of cider rest in the bottom, a thin amber film that shifts as you tilt the cup this way and that, catching the lantern light in small, bright sparks. The cup is empty now, but for those drops, and you set it down on the barrel head beside the pipette and the bung, its emptiness a quiet statement of a task accomplished. The taste of the cider lingers on your tongue for a long, slow while, changing gradually as the minutes pass, the initial dryness giving way to a gentle, warm aftertaste that is clean and faintly floral, the last gift of the apple blossoms that bloomed in a spring that feels very far away now but is somehow still present in this cellar, in this barrel, in this first careful sip of the new season's cider. You pick up the bung and press it gently back into the bunghole, sealing the barrel against the cellar air so that the cider will not oxidize while you prepare the tools for the racking. The bung seats with a soft, firm pressure, and you give it a small additional press with the heel of your hand to ensure it is tight, though not so tight that it cannot be removed again when the time comes. The pipette is returned to its leather loop on the side of the rack, where it will hang until the next tasting day, and the wooden cup is wiped clean with a corner of the linen scrap and set back on the shelf, its purpose fulfilled. You stand for a moment with your hands resting on the curved stave of the full barrel, feeling the cool, dense presence of the cider inside, and you know with a quiet certainty that the work can now begin in earnest. The slow, patient work of transferring this young, clear cider from its first home to a second, leaving behind the sediments of its birth, so that it may age in peace and clarity, a quiet, amber sleep that will last until the tapping mallet finds the bung and the first glass is poured for the harvest table. The cellar holds its breath around you, and you hold yours with it, and the lantern flame continues its slow, steady burn, marking the passage of time with a constancy that asks for no recognition and receives none. The bung comes free with the same soft, sucking sound it made before, a small round note that is swallowed immediately by the thick, patient air of the cellar, and you set it aside on the clean linen scrap that still waits on the barrel head, its edges curling slightly from the dampness of the morning. The bung hole opens before you like a dark, round eye, and the scent of the young cider rises through it in a gentle, continuous exhalation that carries all the notes you discovered in the tasting, the sharp green apple, the wet stone, the whisper of barn straw, and the clean, cool bass of spring water. You lean forward just enough to glimpse the surface of the cider far below, a faint golden disk that reflects the lantern flame as a wavering, upside-down teardrop of light, and you note with quiet satisfaction that the surface is still, its stillness so complete that the reflection does not tremble or break. The lees have settled fully, a thick, cloudy blanket resting on the bottom curve of the barrel, and above them the cider waits in a clarity that promises a clean racking. You reach for the copper racking cane that has been waiting beside you, its curved end pointing upward like the neck of a resting swan, the linen hose still attached to its straight outlet and draped over your shoulder in a loose, dry coil. The cane is cool in your hands, its patina of green and rose gold catching the lantern light in a soft, metallic glimmer, and you lower it slowly into the bung hole with a care that has become second nature over years of this same motion, a care that feels less like caution and more like a kind of quiet respect for the liquid that sleeps below. The curved end descends through the darkness inch by inch, and you feel the slight liquid resistance when it pierces the surface, a resistance that travels up through the copper and into your fingers as a tiny muted vibration, the cider parting around the metal with a sound too small to hear. You continue to lower the cane, watching the straight shaft disappear into the barrel, and you stop when the curved tip is suspended just above the sediment layer, a position you judge not by sight but by a practiced sense that lives in your hands and your wrists and your shoulders, a knowledge that tells you the tip is floating in the clearest part of the liquid, far enough from the lees that the gentle suction of the siphon will not disturb them. The linen hose hangs from the cane's outlet, its other end still coiled loosely in your free hand. And you turn now toward the small oaken pail that rests on the floor beside the cradle of the new barrel, a pail that is clean and dry and waiting. You lower the free end of the hose into the pail, letting it uncurl with a soft, whispering rustle against the clay floor, and then you bend forward and place your lips around the end of the copper outlet where the hose is attached, a small, practiced motion that is as familiar as drawing breath. You draw gently on the tube, a short, steady pull that creates a vacuum in the cane, and you feel the cider begin to rise through the copper with a soft, liquid tremor, a sensation that travels back through the metal and into your mouth as a coolness before the liquid itself arrives. The moment the cider reaches your lips, you pull away and direct the hose into the pail, and the siphon begins with a sudden, quiet gurgle, the first amber stream arcing from the linen tube and splashing into the bottom of the pail with a sound that is half liquid and half music, a clear, low note that seems to fill the cellar without disturbing its stillness. The cider flows in a steady, unbroken stream, the color of pale honey caught in the lantern light, and the pail fills with a slowness that is almost imperceptible unless you watch the liquid level climb against the dark, stained staves. The sound of the flow changes as the pail fills, the initial hollow splashing giving way to a deeper, more resonant glug 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 as the cider rises above the bottom and begins to cover the mouth of the hose, and then the sound softens further, becoming a gentle, continuous murmur that is barely louder than the hiss of the lantern or the distant, imagined drip of moisture from the eaves above. The scent of the cider intensifies in the immediate space around the pail, a sharp, sweet fragrance that seems to bloom outward from the moving liquid, filling your nostrils with that familiar blend of apple and earth and yeast, and you breathe it in without thinking, letting it become part of the rhythm of the work. You watch the pail fill to within a handspan of its rim, the amber surface trembling slightly with the motion of the incoming stream, and then you lower your hand to the handle and lift. The weight of the full pail settles into your forearm and your shoulder, a modest, familiar weight that is no more than a gallon or so, and you turn with it toward the new barrel that rests on its chestnut cradle, a few paces away. The walk is short, only 5 steps across the packed clay floor, and your wooden shoes make that same soft, muffled thud with each placement, a sound that seems to keep time with the slow pulse of the lantern flame and the distant, regular settling of the house above. The pail swings gently at your side, the cider inside rocking with a faint liquid slosh that laps against the staves and then subsides as you steady your gait, and you feel the coolness of the pail's wood through your fingers, a coolness that is only slightly cooler than the cellar air itself. At the new barrel, a clean linen cloth has been spread over the mouth of a wooden funnel, the cloth's edges hanging down over the funnel's rim in soft, white folds, and the funnel itself sits snugly in the bunghole of the waiting cask, its wide end pointing upward like an open flower. The cloth is the same bleached linen as the hose, its weave tight and fine, and it will catch any stray particles of sediment that might have been drawn through the cane despite your care, ensuring that the cider entering the new barrel is as clear as patience can make it. You lift the pail with both hands, tilting it slowly over the funnel, and the cider spills from its rim in a broad amber sheet that strikes the cloth with a soft, spreading hiss, darkening the white linen to a pale, tawny brown as it filters through. The liquid passes through the cloth and the funnel and falls into the new barrel with a sound that is deeper and more resonant than the sound of the pail filling, a low, hollow plash that echoes faintly within the empty cask, its tone changing as the level rises and the airspace within the barrel shrinks, the echo becoming gradually less hollow, more solid, more contained. You pour until the pail is empty, the last few drops falling from its rim in slow, separate beads that catch the lantern light and flash like tiny, falling stars before they are absorbed into the cloth, and then you shake the pail gently to release any remaining cider that clings to its inner staves. A single, small flick of the wrist that sends a final, thin trickle through the funnel. The cloth, now wet and stained, continues to drip for a moment after the pouring stops, a slow, rhythmic drip that patters against the surface of the cider in the new barrel with a series of soft, musical taps, each one separated by a long, measured silence as the last of the liquid works its way through the fabric. You watch these drops fall without hurry, counting them the way you might count the slow, distant drips from the eaves on a misty morning, and then you lift the cloth and funnel aside and peer into the bunghole of the new barrel to see the level of the cider within. It has risen by no more than a finger's depth, a small incremental gain that represents the first of many pails, the first small step in the long, patient work of the racking. You replace the cloth and funnel and turn back toward the full barrel, the empty pail swinging lightly in your hand, and you kneel again beside the pail's resting spot to begin the cycle again. The siphon has continued its steady flow in your absence, the linen hose still releasing its amber stream into the space where the pail once sat, and a small shallow puddle of cider has formed on the clay floor, spreading outward in a dark glistening stain that seeps into the packed earth with a slow, thirsty absorption. You move the pail quickly into place, catching the stream before more is lost, and the rhythm resumes without any sense of interruption, the flow of cider from hose to pail, continuing as if it had never been paused. The sound of the filling begins again, that same soft, liquid gurgle, and you settle into a crouch beside the pail, your hands resting on your knees, your breathing slow and even, your mind as still as the surface of the cider in the barrel behind you. The work settles into a pattern that is less a series of actions and more a single continuous motion stretched across time, a motion in which the boundaries between one pail and the next blur and soften until they disappear entirely. You lift, you carry, you pour, you return, and each cycle takes perhaps 2 minutes by the slow, unmarked clock of the cellar, though you do not count the minutes or the cycles, feeling only the gradual, accumulating weight of the work in the slight, pleasant ache that builds in your forearms and the small of your back. The lantern light shifts almost imperceptibly across the floor as the morning outside advances, the flame burning steadily downward through the oil, the shadows cast by the barrels elongating by fractions of an inch with each passing hour, a movement so slow that it registers only when you look up after many cycles and notice that the dark patch beside the sump channel has stretched from the wall to the foot of the nearest cradle. The cider in the full barrel drops inch by inch, its surface descending past the chalk mark you scratched on the inside of the stave last autumn to mark the fill level, and as it drops, the curve of the barrel's interior is revealed, a dark, damp arc of oak that gleams wetly in the light of the lantern when you lean over the bunghole to check the progress. The smell of the cellar changes as the work continues, the sharp, clean scent of raw cider from the pail and the funnel mingling with the older, deeper perfume of the full barrel being emptied and the new barrel being filled, creating layers of fragrance that shift and overlap as you move between the two. Near the full barrel, the air carries the yeasty, settled smell of the fermentation, a smell that is round and soft and faintly bready. Near the new barrel, the air is brighter and cleaner, the scent of fresh, young cider splashing into fresh, new oak, a scent that promises the slow aging to come. And woven through both is the constant, cool, mineral note of the stone walls, the smell of the earth itself, the grounding presence that underlies everything in the cellar, and that seems to grow stronger as the day wears on, as if the earth is breathing its own slow, patient breath in rhythm with the work. You pause occasionally, not because you are tired, but because the work invites pauses. Small moments of stillness, in which you straighten your back and roll your shoulders and let your gaze wander over the rows of barrels and the shrouded press in the corner and the dust motes drifting in the lantern beam. In these pauses, the siphon continues its steady flow into the pail, and you listen to the sound it makes, that soft, liquid murmur that has become as familiar as your own heartbeat, a sound that seems to hold the cellar in a kind of gentle suspension. You check the position of the racking cane in the full barrel, ensuring that the tip remains well above the sediment layer, and you note with quiet approval that the cider emerging from the hose is as clear as it was when you began, perhaps even clearer, the last of the suspended yeast having settled out in the minutes since the racking started. The sediment layer itself remains undisturbed, a thick, cloudy mass that rests on the bottom of the barrel with a stillness that is almost geological, and every time you peer into the bunghole to check it, you feel a small, quiet satisfaction, the satisfaction of a task being done correctly and carefully, without haste. The pails add up without being counted, their contents merging in the new barrel into a single, growing volume of cider that rises slowly past the lower chime and begins to climb the curved belly of the cask. You can gauge the progress by the changing sound of the pour, the hollow plash of the early pails giving way to a denser, more muted splash as the liquid level rises and the airspace shrinks, and eventually the sound becomes a soft, steady gurgle as the funnel's outlet is submerged and the cider enters the new barrel without falling through air, simply joining the larger body of liquid below with a gentle, blending murmur. You lift the funnel and cloth occasionally to check the level, and each time you do, the amber surface has climbed higher, its color deepening as the depth increases, the pale honeyed hue of a thin layer becoming the rich glowing amber of a full cask, a color that seems to hold the lantern light within itself and radiate it back with a warmth that is entirely visual, for the cider itself remains cool. The temperature of the deep earth, the light on the cellar floor continues its slow migration, the shadow of the eastern wall retreating by a handspan, then another, and the dust motes in the lantern beam shift their slow vertical dance, some settling onto the barrel heads, others drifting up toward the beams and vanishing into the darkness. A field mouse, the same one that rustled in the straw behind the empty casks, makes a brief, cautious appearance at the edge of the lantern circle, its whiskers twitching, its small dark eyes reflecting the flame as two tiny bright sparks, and then it turns and scuttles back into the shadows, its claws making a faint, scratching patter on the clay that fades almost before you register it. The house above continues its quiet settling, a single floorboard creaking under the weight of a chair being drawn back from the table, the sound traveling down through the stone and the beams as a low, comfortable vibration, a reminder that life continues in its slow, parallel course above while you work in the cool, dim silence below. The full barrel nears its end, the cider within it reduced to a shallow pool that barely covers the bottom curve, and you know from long experience that the time has come to stop, to leave the last few inches of liquid above the lees undisturbed, so that the sediment does not cloud the clarity you have worked so patiently to preserve. You lift the racking cane with a slow, careful motion, withdrawing it inch by inch through the bunghole, and you hold it upright so that the cider remaining in the tube drains backward into the barrel, a small, silent concession to the waste that every racking leaves behind. A few cupfuls of good cider sacrificed to the clarity of the rest. The hose drips its last few drops into the pail, and then you coil it loosely and set it aside, the linen dark and wet now, clinging to itself in soft, damp folds. The racking cane is wiped with a clean rag and returned to its hook, its copper surface gleaming faintly with a fresh coat of cider that will soon darken into a new layer of patina, adding another thin stratum to the record of its years. The new barrel is nearly full, its bunghole open and waiting, and you lift the funnel and cloth for the last time, wringing the cloth gently over the barrel to release the final cloudy drips of cider that it has caught, and then you set both aside, on the floor beside the cradle. The surface of the cider within the new barrel is still and clear, a perfect amber mirror that reflects the lantern flame as a small, steady star, and you stand for a moment looking down at it, feeling the quiet, deep satisfaction of a task completed without flaw, without hurry, without any disturbance of the peace that lives in this room. The old barrel, now all but empty, still holds its thick layer of lees in the bottom, a pale, cloudy sediment that will later be poured into the stone jar for the kitchen or the pig's trough. But that is a task for another moment, a small, final tidying that can wait while you rest and let the stillness of the cellar settle around you once more. You reach for the bung of birchwood that you tested earlier, and you press it gently into the bunghole of the new barrel, seating it with a firm, even pressure that will hold it fast against the slow, residual fermentation that may yet produce a few last bubbles of gas. The bung slides into place with a soft wooden thump that is muted by the dampness of the wood, a sound that seems to mark the end of the work, with a quiet, definitive note, a note that echoes once against the low ceiling and then fades into the general hush of the cellar. The cider is racked, the lees are left behind, and the new barrel now joins the rows of its fellows, another sleeper in the long, dark dormitory of the earth, waiting through the months of winter and spring and summer for the day when its bung will be drawn and its contents will be poured into cups and raised to the light. You stand in the center of the cellar, your hands resting at your sides, your breathing slow and deep, and the lantern flame, now burning lower, casts its familiar flickering circle of light over the packed clay floor, the waiting barrels, the shrouded press, and the quiet figure of the cider maker who has done his work and is at peace. The air in the cellar does not change all at once, does not shift from one state to another in any way that can be marked by a moment or a threshold. It is a gradual, continuous transformation that unfolds with the same slowness as the dust motes drifting through the lantern beam and the shadows inching across the packed clay floor. You become aware of it only because you have paused in your work, the pail empty in your hand, and the siphon still murmuring its soft liquid note into the space near the full barrel, and in that pause you find yourself drawing a long, deep breath that fills your lungs with a fragrance different from the one you breathed when you first descended the stone steps this morning. The cool mineral scent of the cellar is still present, the constant grounding note that underlies everything like the drone of a bagpipe beneath a melody. But layered upon it now are other scents, richer and more complex, the perfumes of fermentation rising from the open barrel and the newly filled cask and the residue of cider that has spilled onto the clay floor in small dark splashes that are slowly drying into sticky aromatic patches. You set the pail down without thinking, your hands moving through the familiar motions of the work while your attention drifts to the olfactory world that surrounds you. A world as real and as layered as the visual world of barrels and shadows, but one that is easier to overlook because it asks nothing of the eyes and everything of the breath. The scent of raw apple juice is the first to rise, sharp and clean and bright, cutting through the general coolness of the air like a single, high note struck on a glass. It is the scent that filled the pressing room in September, when the stone wheel crushed the first basket of apples, releasing a spray of juice that spattered the walls and the aprons and the faces of the workers with tiny, sticky drops that dried into sweet, fragrant spots. That same scent lives now in the stream of cider flowing from the linen hose, in the shallow pool trembling within the pail, in the wet cloth that filters each pour, a scent that is as simple and direct as the taste of a green apple plucked from the branch and bitten into with the morning dew still on its skin. It carries within it the memory of sunlight on the orchard slope, the warmth of the late summer afternoons, when the apples swelled and ripened, the cool nights of early autumn when the first frosts touched the fruit and concentrated their sugars, all of that gone now except for this clean, fleeting perfume that will fade as the cider ages and the fermentation's deeper work begins. Beneath the raw juice, or rather wrapped around it like a softer, rounder layer, is the scent of the fermentation itself, the breath of the yeast that has lived and multiplied in the dark barrel for 6 weeks and is now slowly, quietly dying as the last sugars are consumed. This scent is harder to describe, not because it is faint, but because it is complex, a shifting, living thing that changes even as you inhale it, revealing one face and then another. The first face is the yeasty, bready aroma that reminds you of dough rising in a wooden trough beside the kitchen hearth, a warm, comforting smell that speaks of nourishment and patience and the quiet magic of transformation. The second face is orchard blossom, a delicate, honeyed sweetness that seems impossible in a cellar so far from spring and yet is undeniably present, rising from the cider like the ghost of the flowers that bloomed on the apple trees in May and were visited by bees whose descendants are now sleeping in the hive behind the barn. The blossom scent is fragile, coming and going with each breath, present one moment and vanished the next, so that you find yourself inhaling again and again to catch it, to hold it, to confirm that it is still there. The third face of the fermentation is a hint of bruised fruit, soft and slightly overripe, a scent that is not unpleasant but mellow and deep, the smell of an apple that has rested in the grass for a morning and whose flesh has begun to yield to the gentle pressure of decay, a decay that is not rot, but the first quiet step toward becoming something else, something more concentrated and more complex. These three faces of the fermentation scent do not succeed one another in any order, but exist simultaneously, woven together into a single layered perfume that shifts with the currents of air moving through the cellar. When you stand near the open bung hole of the full barrel, the yeasty note is stronger, rising directly from the surface of the cider, where the last bubbles of gas are still occasionally breaking, with a soft, wet pop that releases a tiny puff of carbon dioxide and a brief, intense burst of bready fragrance. When you move toward the new barrel, where the cider is being poured through the cloth and the funnel, the orchard blossom note dominates, as if the agitation of the pouring has awakened some volatile essence that was sleeping in the liquid, calling it forth into the air where it can be breathed and known. And when you pause in the center of the cellar, equidistant from both barrels, the bruised fruit note comes forward, a mellow amber perfume that seems to hover in the middle air like a visible haze, a scent that speaks of ripeness and completion, and the slow, inevitable passage of time. Beneath all of these, serving as a foundation and a frame, is the scent of the oak barrels themselves, a scent that has been part of the cellar for so long that you have almost ceased to notice it. Yet when you turn your attention to it, you find it everywhere, a nutty, vanilla-like fragrance that the wood has been releasing into the air for decades. A fragrance that comes from the tannins and the lignins, and the slow chemical transformation that happens when oak is kept in a cool, damp place, and allowed to age with the same as the cider it contains. The older barrels, the ones that have held cider for 10 or 20 or 50 years, have a scent that is deeper and earthier, the vanilla notes having darkened into something closer to mushroom or forest floor, a rich, humic aroma that speaks of time and stillness and the slow, quiet work of the years. The newer barrels, like the one you are filling today, smell fresher and brighter, the vanilla and the nuttiness still raw and forward, mixed with the faint, astringent tang of fresh-cut oak and the ghost of the fire that was used to bend the staves, a ghost that persists as a whisper of smoke, so faint it is more a memory of a scent than a scent itself. When you lean close to the new barrel and press your nose to the wet staves where the cider has splashed, you can smell the oak's promise, the slow exchange that will happen over the coming months as the wood gives its character to the liquid, and the liquid, in turn, stains the wood gives its character to the liquid, and the liquid, in turn, stains the wood a deeper, richer hue. A conversation between tree and fruit that will continue long after you have left the cellar and forgotten this particular morning. The cold mineral note of the stone walls weaves through all of these scents, connecting them and holding them in place, a clean, sharp thread that runs from the floor to the ceiling and from the oldest barrel to the newest pour. It is the scent of limestone and flint, of the deep chalk that lies beneath the soil of the orchard and the clay floor of the cellar, a scent that is as old as the land itself and as indifferent to the work of men as the slow drip of water from the ceiling stone. When you breathe deeply, you can separate this note from the others, isolating it like a single, clear tone in a chord. And it brings with it a sensation of coolness that is more than temperature, a sense of the deep earth and the long, slow ages that have passed since the chalk was laid down by ancient seas and the flint was formed in nodules within it, and the cellar was dug out of that chalk, and the barrels were placed in that cellar, and now, in this quiet morning of 1788, you stand breathing of the Hahnkians. You pause again, this time not to lift the pail but simply to stand still and breathe, letting the olfactory whirls fill your senses completely. The sound of the siphon continues its soft, liquid gurgle, the lantern its steady hiss, the house above its occasional distant creak, but these sounds are now background to the foreground of scent, a world of fragrance that is as rich and as detailed as the visual world of the cellar, and yet is entirely invisible, existing only in the moment of its inhalation, and then fading into the next birth, the next subtle shift of the air currents that carry it. You close your eyes without intending to, and the darkness behind your eyelids becomes a canvas for the scents to paint themselves upon, the sharp green of the raw juice, the golden warmth of the yeast, the pale pink of the orchard blossom, the soft brown of the bruised fruit, the deep umber of the old oak, the bright silver of the stone, all of them blending and separating and blending again in a slow, quiet dance that has no choreography and no destination, a dance molicate. The one that the old barrel that you are emptying has a smell all its own, a smell that is earthier and fuller and more settled than the new barrel's fresh promise. Every time you lean over its bunghole to check the sediment level, you are met by a gust of air that seems to rise from the very bottom of the cask, thick with the weight of weeks of quiet fermentation, carrying the solid, grounded perfume of lees and yeast and apple flesh that has given everything it had to the liquid and now rests in a thick, cloudy blanket, waiting to be separated and set aside. This smell is not unpleasant, though it lacks the bright, clean edge of the raw juice. It is a smell of completion, of a process that has run its course, of a liquid that has finished its first vigorous transformation and is now ready to move on to the next stage of its life. It is the smell of a chapter ending, a quiet, gentle finality that carries no sadness, only the calm satisfaction of work well done. The new barrel, by contrast, smells of fresh wood and promise, the raw, sappy sweetness of oak that has not yet been tempered by years of contact with cider, mixed with the clean, cool scent of the funnel cloth and the faint, metallic tang of the copper cane. When you pour a pail of cider into it, the scent that rises from the bunghole is a sudden, bright plume of all the notes together, a concentrated burst of apple and yeast and blossom and oak that fills the air around you and then slowly disperses, drifting up toward the low ceiling beams and mixing with the general atmosphere of the cellar. After each pour, you pause and breathe in this plume, noting how it changes. As the barrel fills and the airspace within shrinks, the scent becoming less explosive and more sustained. A gentle, continuous exhalation rather than a sudden burst, as if the barrel itself is breathing out the fragrance of the cider it now contains, settling into a long, slow respiration that will continue for months. Between the two barrels, as you carry the pail back and forth, you pass through a middle zone where the scents of the old and the new mingle in equal measure, a zone defined only by your own movement and existing only as long as you stand within it. In this zone, the sharpness of the raw juice and the earthiness of the old fermentation meet and blend, creating a hybrid scent that is neither one nor the other, a bridge between the beginning and the end of the process. You find yourself slowing as you pass through this zone, not consciously, but simply because the scent invites slowness, invites a moment of standing still with the pail in your hand and your head slightly lifted, your nostrils flaring gently as you take in the full, layered complexity of the air. The cellar's ventilation slit, that narrow opening high in the gable wall, admits a faint current of outside air that is colder and cleaner and carries no scent at all except a hint of damp grass and stone, and this current stirs the fragrances in the cellar without dispersing them, turning them over like the gentle turning of a compost heap, exposing new surfaces and releasing new notes that were previously hidden. One of these hidden notes is the scent of the apple skins themselves, a faint, waxy perfume that clings to the cider despite all the weeks of fermentation, a perfume that you can detect only when the other, stronger scents have faded from your attention. It is the smell of a whole apple held in the hand, the red or yellow or green skin warmed by the sun and rubbed to a soft sheen, a smell that is almost tactile, almost a texture rather than a fragrance, smooth and slightly oily and deeply familiar. Another hidden note is the scent of the rye straw that was used in the pressing, a dry golden smell that has somehow survived the transformation from straw to juice to cider, persisting as a faint grassy whisper at the very edge of perception, a whisper that you would not notice if you were not listening for it, breathing slowly and deeply, letting the air fill every corner of your lungs before you release it in a long, quiet sigh. The scent of the clay floor itself rises when you step on a patch that has been dampened by spilled cider, a rich, earthy smell that is the smell of soil after a gentle rain, a smell that connects the cellar to the orchard above and the fields beyond, and the whole slow-turning world of growth and decay and renewal. The spilled cider, soaking into the packed earth, begins to ferment in its own small way, the wild yeasts that live on every surface of the cellar finding the sugar and beginning their quiet work, releasing a faint, sour tang that will fade as the puddle dries and the yeast exhausts its brief, accidental feast. This scent is so faint that you catch it only once, when you kneel to adjust the position of the pail, your face close to the floor, the damp clay inches from your nose, and then it is gone, replaced by the more dominant fragrances of the barrels and the cider and the stone. Time passes without measure, marked only by the gradual shift in the scents as the racking progresses and the old barrel empties and the new barrel fills. The sharp, raw juice scent that was so bright at the beginning of the work begins to soften, fading into the deeper, more complex perfume of the fermentation, as if the cider itself is moving from youth to maturity in the space of a single morning. The yeast note grows rounder and mellower, the blossom note more subdued, the bruised fruit note more prominent, and beneath them all the oak and the stone remain constant, unchanging, the fixed points around which the other scents revolve. By the time the old barrel is nearly empty and the new barrel is nearly full, the cellar air has settled into a stable, harmonious fragrance that seems to embody the entire process in a single, sustained chord. A fragrance that is the smell of cider making itself, the smell of patience and care and the slow, quiet work of the seasons. A smell that you will carry with you when you ascend the stone steps back into the misty morning, clinging to your clothes and your cairn, and your care and the blessing. A reminder of the deep peace of the pive la the vive that writhe for you rodenive to the barge. The rhythm of the racking cane is not a sound you hear so much as a presence you inhabit. A quiet, steady pulse that has been running through the cellar since the moment the siphon first began to flow, and that now, after many pails and many pourings, has become as much a part of the morning as the lantern's flame or the cool breath of the stone walls. The cane itself rests in the bunghole of the full barrel, with the stillness of a heron standing in a stream, its curved copper neck disappearing into the dark liquid, and the only sign of its work is the stream of amber cider that emerges from the linen hose and falls into the waiting pail with a soft, continuous murmur that never changes in pitch or volume. A single note, held without vibrato, a note that the ear accepts and then forgets, folding it into the general quiet of the cellarless. As the threaded stradrastedly at furthed, you stand beside the pail, one hand resting on the rim, feeling the faint vibration of the falling cider transmitted through the wood into your fingertips, a vibration so subtle it is more like the memory of a touch than a touch itself. The flow is steady, a glass-clear column of liquid that catches the lantern light and holds it, turning from amber to gold to pale straw as it arcs through the air, and the surface of the cider in the pail trembles constantly under the impact, a fine concentric shiver that spreads outward from the center in rings that break against the staves and rebound, crossing each other in delicate patterns that reform themselves with every passing second. Watching this surface is like watching the slow breathing of a sleeping animal, a motion so regular and so gentle that it stills the mind by giving it something calm to rest upon. Your hands have learned the weight of the full pail without any conscious instruction, the exact heft that signals it is time to lift and carry, and they respond now with the same automatic ease with which they lift a spoon at the table or a stick from the woodpile. The pail's handle presses into your palm along a line that has been worn smooth by years of the same grip. The ashwood, dark and glossy, where the skin oils and the friction have polished it, and the slight creak that the handle makes when you take the weight is as familiar as the sound of a door latch lifting, a sound that belongs to this place and this work and no other. You rise from your crouch in a single unhurried motion, the muscles of your thighs and your lower back engaging in a smooth sequence that requires no thought, and you turn toward the new barrel with the pail swinging gently at your side, the cider inside rocking with a soft liquid slosh that slaps once, twice against the wood and then settles as you steady your gait. The walk to the new barrel is exactly 5 paces, a distance you could measure with your eyes closed by the feel of the clay floor under your wooden shoes, and each pace falls with the same soft, muffled thud that has been the heartbeat of this work since the first pail was poured. The sound of your footsteps merges with the sound of the siphon, the soft tap of your shoes on the packed earth alternating with the continuous murmur of the flowing cider in a rhythm that has no downbeat and no measure, a rhythm that simply exists, steady and unbroken, like the rhythm of waves on a lake shore or the rhythm of wind through a field of wheat. You reach the new barrel and tilt the pail with a slow, controlled rotation of your wrists, and the cider pours from the rim in a broad amber sheet that darkens the waiting cloth and vanishes through the funnel, and the sound that rises from the bunghole is the same deep, hollow plash that has greeted every pail, a sound that has grown gradually less hollow and more solid as the barrel fills, the space within it shrinking, the air column shortening, the echo changing in subtle, incremental ways that would be imperceptible. It's portamwist uguts stage. The empty pail swings back to your side, its weight now negligible, the wood so light it might be a toy, and you retrace your 5 paces to the full barrel, where the linen hose is still discharging its steady amber stream into the space the pail has vacated, the small dark puddle already forming on the clay, where the first drops fell during your absence. You kneel and replace the pail beneath the flow, and the rhythm resets, the cycle beginning again without a seam, without a joint, a continuous loop that has been turning since the first pail, and will turn until the last, and the boundary between one pail and the next blurs and softens until the only thing that distinguishes them is the very slight, very gradual diminution of the flow as the cider level in the full barrel drops and the siphon's pressure decreases by tiny, imperceptible increments. The stream thins by a hair, by a fraction of a hair, so slowly that you cannot see it change, can only know it has changed when you look back across the morning and realize that the pail feels a few heartbeats slower now than it did at the start. A difference so small it is not a delay, but merely a softening of pace. A gentle deceleration that matches the gentle deceleration of the day itself. The physical sensations of the work have settled into a low, steady hum that pervades your body without rising to the level of discomfort. A quiet awareness of the muscles and the joints and the skin that is not pain, but presence. Your forearms carry a slight, diffuse ache that comes not from lifting anything heavy, but from the sustained, gentle effort of gripping and tilting and carrying. An ache that spreads from the wrist to the elbow in a warm, liquid band. A sensation that is almost pleasant in its mildness. The kind of ache that tells you work has been done without telling you to stop. Your shoulders have loosened as the morning has progressed, the initial stiffness of the cool cellar air giving way to a fluid ease that allows your arms to swing freely and your back to bend and straighten without catch or creak. And the faint, residual tightness in your lower spine, a leftover from a long ago fall from a ladder in the orchard, has faded to a distant, neutral presence, a companionable shadow that neither speaks nor demands. Your hands, which have been wet with cider and dry with oak and cold with copper and warm with your own blood, feel alive in a quiet, humming way. The skin of your palms slightly tacky from the dried juice, the knuckles faintly pink from the cool air, the fingertips sensitive enough to detect the grain of the oak staves when you brush them, the slight, regular ridges of the wood like the lines of a map that leads nowhere. You pause between pails, not from weariness, but from an impulse that is woven into the rhythm itself, a rest beat that belongs to the work as naturally as the inhale belongs to the exhale. In these pauses, you straighten your spine and roll your shoulders backward in a slow, deliberate circle, feeling the bones of your upper back shift and settle with a soft internal click that is barely audible even to you. A sound felt rather than heard, a private bodily note. You flex your fingers open and closed, watching the tendons move under the skin of your hands, the thin, pale lines that appear and disappear with each motion, and then you let your arms hang at your sides, the blood returning to your fingertips with a faint, warm tingle that matches the warm, faint pulse of the lantern flame on the stone shelf. The light touches your face in a gentle, indirect wash, and you feel the slight heat of it on your cheek and your brow, a heat so mild it is more like a memory of sunlight than sunlight itself. A reminder of the world above where the mist is still pressing against the small windows and the apple trees are still holding their bare, wet branches in perfect silver stillness. During one of these pauses, you notice that the lantern's flame has begun to flicker with a slight, irregular flutter, a sign that the wick has burned down to a nub and is drawing oil unevenly through its charred tip. You step toward the shelf, your wooden shoes making that same soft thud on the clay, and you lift the horn pane on its small brass hinge, the metal cool against your fingers, the hinge moving with a smooth, silent precision that speaks of the care with which it was made. The flame, now exposed to the open air of the cellar, wavers and dips before steadying, its yellow tongue lengthening and then settling, and you can see the wick clearly now, a blackened, curling thread that rises from the oil reservoir like a tiny burned question mark. You reach for the small brass snuffer that hangs from a hook beneath the shelf, a tool no longer than your finger, its cup-shaped end, blackened inside with a fine sooty velvet, and you press it gently over the wick, extinguishing the flame with a single, soft hiss that leaves behind a thin, grey trail of smoke that rises and twists and vanishes into the shadows near the ceiling beam. The cellar plunges into a darkness that is not complete, for a faint grey light still seeps through the ventilation slit high in the gable wall, a light so weak it reveals nothing but the vaguest outlines of the nearest barrels and the pale, ghostly shape of the linen sheet covering the press. Yet it is enough to see by while you work, enough to trim the wick and refill the oil if needed, enough to remind you that the world outside continues its slow turning even after the earthen quiet. The trimming of the wick is a small ritual inserted into the larger rhythm, a brief, delicate task that requires a steady hand and a patient eye. You produce a tiny pair of iron shears from a niche in the wall, their blades dark with age and oil, and you snip away the charred tip of the wick with a single, precise motion, the cut end falling onto the stone shelf as a flake of black ash that crumbles at the slightest touch. The wick beneath is pale and fresh, its cotton fibers arranged in a neat, flat braid that will draw the oil evenly and burn with a clean, steady flame. You adjust the height of the wick by turning a small brass knob that projects from the side of the burner, and with each tiny rotation, the fresh tip rises a hair's breadth from its brass tube, emerging into the air like a new shoot from dark soil. Satisfied, you strike a spark with the flint and steel that rest in a small soapstone dish beside the snuffer, the spark a brief bright star that lands on the fresh wick and catches immediately, blooming into a small blue flame that quickly warms to yellow as it consumes the first volatile vapors. You lower the horn pane back into place, and the light settles once more into its steady, unwavering circle, illuminating the floor and the barrels and the tools and your own quiet face with a constancy that feels almost like a welcome, a return to the familiar after a brief, necessary darkness. In the silence that follows the relighting, a silence made deeper by the momentary absence of sound that the snuffing created, you become aware of the other rhythms that have been running alongside the rhythm of the racking cane. Rhythms so quiet they are usually lost beneath the more obvious sounds of the work. The distant scratch of a mouse in the straw behind the empty casks, a sound finer than a whisper, a series of tiny, rapid rustles that pause and resume with the cautious, intermittent timing of a small creature moving through dry grass. The house above, settling on its great oak beams with a slow, groaning creak that travels down through the stone walls as a vibration felt more than heard. A deep, low-frequency hum that speaks of timber cooling and contracting, of joists finding their rest, of the slow, constant dialogue between the wooden frame and the stone foundations that has been going on since the day the house was built. The faint, far drip of water from the thatch into the mud outside the kitchen door, a sound so distant it is almost a memory of a sound, each drop falling after a long, variable interval that your mind cannot predict, so that every drop arrives as a small, gentle surprise, a punctuation mark in a sentence that has no words. These background rhythms merge with the foreground rhythm of the cane and the pail and the pour, creating a composite texture of time that is not measured in minutes or hours, but in the accumulation of small, repeated actions, each one identical to the last, and yet each one occupying its own particular moment, its own particular breath. You lift the pail 80 times, or perhaps 90, or perhaps 70, the number never counted and never known, and each lift is the same lift, and each pour is the same pour, and each return is the same return. Yet within that sameness there is a subtle variety that only a patient attention can perceive. A slight difference in the weight of the pail as the cider in the new barrel dripes and the cider in the new barrel rises, a slight change in the sound of the pour as the echo chamber shrinks, a slight evolution in the toothpick. The work is a meditation without an object, a prayer without words, a slow, steady dance performed in a pool of lantern light at the bottom of the earth, and you are the dancer, and the dance, and the floor upon which the dance is danced. All of these things at once, without separation, without distinction. The ache in your forearms, which was once a quiet, pleasant hum, has deepened slightly into a more insistent presence, a warmth that has become a weight, and you notice it now without concern, as you might notice the changing angle of the shadow on the floor, or the fading of the light outside the ventilation slit. It is the natural consequence of sustained effort, as natural as the settling of the lees or the clearing of the cider. And it does not ask you to stop, but merely to acknowledge it, to roll your shoulders one more time, to flex your fingers one more time, to take one more slow, deep breath of the cool, fragrant air before you lift the next pail and carry it, empty, back to the flowing siphon. The rhythm absorbs the ache just as it absorbs everything else, folding it into the ongoing pattern, so that the ache becomes simply another note in the music, a low, warm, steady note that underpins the higher, brighter notes of the pouring and the filling and the soft wooden tapping of the pail against the barrel's side. That tapping is a sound you have not consciously noticed until now, but once you hear it, it becomes as present as the siphon's murmur, a small incidental percussion that accompanies each pour. When you tilt the pail and its rim touches the funnel's edge, the contact produces a soft, muted knock of wood against wood, a sound that the cloth muffles but does not eliminate, and when you set the empty pail down on the clay beside the full barrel, its base strikes the packed earth with a low, hollow thump that resonates briefly through the floor and is felt in the soles of your shoes. These small, rhythmless sounds, a tap here, a thump there, a creak of the handle, a slosh of the liquid, create a gentle, syncopated counterpoint to the steady, unvarying note of the siphon, a delicate arrhythmia that keeps the monotony from becoming monotone, that gives the work a texture as varied as the grain of the oak staves or the patina of the copper cane. The copper cane itself, when you pause to check its position, has grown warmer to the touch, its metal having absorbed the temperature of the cider passing through it, and the patina along its length has darkened slightly where the liquid has been in constant contact, a new layer of oxidation forming even as you watch, the copper interacting with the acid of the cider to create a surface that is constantly changing, constantly becoming something slightly different from what it was. You run a finger along the cane's curve and feel the faint, slimy smoothness of the cider residue, a film that is not sticky but slick, and you wipe it on the leg of your trousers, leaving a thin amber streak on the wool that will dry and fade and be forgotten. The linen hose, too, has changed, its dry, stiff fabric now soft and pliant and heavy with absorbed liquid, its color darkened from pale cream to a wet, tawny brown. And it hangs from the cane's outlet with a limp, relaxed droop that speaks of the weight of the cider still passing through it, a weight that will soon lessen as the full barrel empties its last reserves. The work is approaching its natural end, not with a climax or a fanfare, but with a gradual, gentle winding down, a softening of pace that began when the first pail was poured and has been continuing ever since, imperceptibly, like the slow, steady deceleration of a spinning wheel when the treadle is released. The stream from the hose is noticeably thinner now, a slender amber thread that quivers slightly in the air before it strikes the surface of the cider in the pail, and the sound it makes has changed from a murmur to a whisper, a sound so quiet you must lean close to hear it, a sound that seems to be sharing a secret with the clay floor and the cellar air. The full barrel is nearly empty, its liquid level having retreated past the lower chime and into the final shallow pool that covers the sediment, and you know from the feel of the work, from the weight of the pails and the sound of the pour and the ache in your arms, that the time has come to stop, to lift the cane and drain the hose and let the lees rest undisturbed in their quiet, cloudy bed. You will not rush this ending, any more than you have rushed any part of the work, but you feel it approaching with the same quiet certainty with which you felt the morning's readiness for the first taste, a closing of the circle that has been drawn around this day, this barrel, this slow, patient dance of cider and copper and wood. The new barrel stands full and quiet on its chestnut cradle, its bunghole stoppered with the birchwood plug, you seated with a firm, even pressure what feels like a long while ago, but is in truth only a small portion of the morning, for time in the cellar moves at a pace that has no relation to the clocks of the world above. The cider within has risen to within a handspan of the bun, leaving just enough headspace for any last lazy fermentation that might occur over the coming weeks, a small dark void of air that will protect the liquid from pressure and allow it to breathe in the slow, measured way that aging requires. The surface of the cider, when you peer through the bunghole with the lantern held close, is a perfect, still mirror of deep amber, its clarity so complete that you can see the reflection of your own eyes staring back at you from the darkness, a tiny glimmering image that blinks when you blink and vanishes when you straighten and turn away. You reach for the wooden mallet that has been waiting on the floor beside the cradle, its leather-wrapped head dark and smooth from years of gentle use, its ash handle fitting into your palm with the easy familiarity of a handshake between old friends. The mallet rises and falls in a single short arc, its leather face striking the bung with a soft, cushioned thump that is barely louder than a hand clap in still air. A sound that does not echo but simply occurs and then ceases, absorbed into the packed clay and the stone walls and the patient barrels. You strike the bung twice more, each blow identical to the first. A quiet, rhythmic tapping that seats the tapered plug firmly in its hole, compressing the linen wrapping just enough to form a seal that will keep out the cellar air and the dust and the tiny wandering insects that might otherwise find their way into the cider. The bung is now as tight as it needs to be, tight enough to hold fast, yet not so tight that it cannot be removed with a firm twist of the hand when the time comes for the first tasting of the aged cider, a day that lies months away in the unseen future, a day that will arrive in its own time, and no sooner. With the barrel sealed, you turn your attention to the small piece of slate that rests on the shelf beside the wooden cup and the willow pipette, a piece of roofing slate that was trimmed to a neat rectangle by the same hands that trimmed the slates on the farmhouse roof. Its surface is smooth, dark grey that glitters faintly with microscopic flecks of mica when the lantern light strikes it at the right angle. The slate is cool and dry, its edges slightly rough where the trimming tool left its mark, and it has a small hole drilled through one corner, through which a length of hempen twine has been threaded and tied into a loop that will allow it to be hung from a nail on the barrel head. You collect the slate and a sharp iron nail from the niche in the wall where such small essential objects are kept, and you carry them to the new barrel, kneeling beside the cradle so that your face is level with the curved oaken head. The scratching of the nail on the slate makes a sound that is entirely different from any other sound in the cellar, a high, dry, scratching sound that is almost abrasive in its clarity, a sound that cuts through the soft, quiet air like a single bright line drawn on a grey paper. You work slowly, forming the letters and numbers with a care that is not born of any need for beauty, but simply of a wish for clarity, for a record that will be legible when you or your son's son comes to this barrel years from now and wonders what it contains. The date comes first, scratched in simple upright figures, the day, the month, the year, each separated by a small horizontal dash. The day is the 23rd of November, a date that you know from the rhythm of the season and the position of the sun and the quiet internal calendar that every farmer carries within himself, a calendar that marks time not by printed pages, but by the feel of the air and the color of the leaves and the taste of the first clear cider of the year, and the color of the leaves and the taste of the first clear cider of the year. The year is 1788, a number that you scratch with the same unhurried care as all the others, a number that means nothing in the quiet of the cellar but will one day mean something to someone who reads it. A small, fixed point in the long, slow flow of time. Beneath the date, you scratch a letter that indicates the section of the orchard from which the apples were gathered, a code that is known only to you and your family, and that divides the 200 trees into their various plots, the chalk slope with its bitter apples, the lower meadow with its sweet yellow fruits, the wall border with its sharp green varieties, and the small experimental plot by the stream where young trees are being trained and tested. This barrel holds a blend, and the letter you scratch is the one that denotes the first blend of the season, a mix of bitter and sweet that has produced a cider of particular balance and depth, a cider that will age well and be served at the harvest supper next autumn. Finally, beneath the letter, you scratch a single word in your plain upright hand, a word that is more a label than a description, a statement of fact that needs no elaboration. Claire. The word sits on the slate with a quiet, final authority, a declaration that the cider within has been racked clear, that the lees have been left behind, that the liquid resting in this barrel is as bright and clean as patience and care can make it. You set the nail aside and lift the slate by its twine loop, turning it in the lantern light to check the legibility of your work. The scratches are pale grey against the dark grey of the slate, a subtle contrast that will be visible to anyone who looks closely, and the twine is strong and clean, its fibers tightly twisted, its knot secure. You carry the slate to the new barrel and loop the twine over a small iron nail that has been driven into the barrel head for this very purpose, a nail that was placed there by the cooper, and that has waited, empty, since the day the barrel was made. The slate hangs against the curved staves with a soft, dry click, settling into a slight angle that will allow it to be read without being removed. And it will hang there through the winter and the spring and the summer, a quiet sentinel that watches over the sleeping cider and marks its identity for anyone who might need to know. The labeling done, you straighten from your crouch and let your gaze travel over the cellar, taking in the scene with a slow, quiet attention that is not appraisal, but acknowledgement. A simple recognition of what has been done and what remains to be done. The full barrel that you empty now stands nearly empty on its cradle across the aisle, its bung still open, the last few inches of cider covering the lees in a shallow amber pool that is already beginning to settle again after the disturbance of the racking. The racking cane, still wet and gleaming, rests on the floor beside it, the linen hose coiled loosely beside it in a dark, damp spiral that will need to be rinsed and hung to dry. The oaken pail, stained and sticky with the residue of 100 small pourings, sits upturned on the clay near the new barrel, its handle folded flat, its interior dark and damp. The funnel and the filtering cloth lie beside it, the cloth crumpled and stained a deep tawny brown, the funnel's wooden surface beaded with tiny droplets of cider that catch the light like seed pearls. The tools have done their work, and now they wait, patient and silent, for the hands that will clean them and return them to their hooks and pegs on the rack. You begin the tidying with the racking cane, lifting it from the floor and carrying it to the corner where the sump channel runs along the eastern wall, a shallow, clay-lined groove that carries any spilled liquid toward the small dry basin in the corner. A bucket of clean well water has been waiting there since you drew it this morning, its surface still and cold, a faint mineral scent rising from it that speaks of deep, chalk-filtered aquifers and long, slow journeys through the dark earth. You lower the copper cane into the bucket, submerging its curved end and its straight shaft, and you draw water through it by sucking gently on the outlet, a sharp, cold mouthful that you spit into the sump channel before you begin the proper rinsing. The water flows through the cane with a soft, bubbling gurgle, chasing the last traces of cider from the inner walls, and the stream that emerges from the outlet is pale and cloudy at first, then gradually clearer, then perfectly transparent, the water running clean and pure through the copper and splashing into the sump with a bright, liquid sound. You lift the cane from the bucket and shake it gently to dislodge any remaining drops, then wipe its exterior with a clean rag that hangs from a peg beside the tool rack, a rag that is itself a veteran of many cleanings, its fabric stained with a permanent amber patina that will never wash out. The copper gleams dully in the lantern light, its surface clean but unchanged, the green and rose gold patina undisturbed by the rinsing, a permanent record of years of cider and air that you have no wish to remove. You hang the cane on its special hook, the one that was bent to shape by the village blacksmith, and it settles into place with a soft, metallic click that seems to signal the return of order, the restoration of the tool to its appointed place. The linen hose comes next, a limp, wet coil that you lift from the floor with both hands, the fabric heavy and cool and slate with cider residue. You take it to the bucket and immerse it completely, working the fabric between your fingers with a gentle, rhythmic squeezing that releases the absorbed cider in pale amber clouds that swirl through the clear water and then fade. The water in the bucket darkens with each squeeze, turning from clear to pale gold to a deep tawny amber, and you empty the bucket into the sump channel and refill it from the larger water barrel that stands against the wall, repeating the rinsing until the water runs clear and the hose smells only of wet linen and the faint, clean scent of the well. You drape the rinsed hose over a wooden drying rack that hangs from the ceiling beams, a simple construction of parallel poles that allows the fabric to hang in loose, open loops, and the water drips from it in slow, separate drops that fall onto the clay floor with a soft, intermittent patter, each drop raising a tiny, dark crater in the packed earth before it soaks away. The oaken pail requires a more thorough cleaning, for its interior is coated with a sticky film of dried cider that has accumulated over the many cycles of the racking. You take it to the bucket and fill it partway with water, then use a small, stiff-bristled brush made of boar's hair to scrub the inner staves, working the brush in slow circular motions that loosen the residue and release it into the water in thin, brown streams. The bristles make a soft, rhythmic shushing sound against the wood, a sound that is neither loud nor harsh, but simply present, a part of the tidying as much as the splash of the water and the clink of the pail's handle against its rim. You rinse the pail 3 times, emptying the water into the sump after each rinsing, and when the last rinse runs clear and the interior of the pail is clean and smooth to the touch, you set it upside down on the floor beside the drying rack, where it will drain and dry in the cool, patient air. The funnel and the filtering cloth are the last items to be cleaned, and you attend to them with the same unhurried care, rinsing the wooden funnel inside and out until the water runs clear, then scrubbing the cloth with the boar's hairbrush until the worst of the staining has been lifted. The cloth will never be white again, for the tannins of the cider have dyed its fibers a permanent, pale brown that is the color of weak tea, but it is clean, and it will serve for many more rackings before it wears thin and must be replaced by a new square of linen woven on the winter loom. You spread the cloth over the drying rack beside the hose, smoothing its wrinkles with a flat palm, and you hang the funnel from a peg where it will drain and dry without touching the floor. With the tools cleaned and put away, you turn your attention to the old barrel and its burden of lees. The shallow pool of cider that remains above the sediment is still relatively clear, for the siphon was stopped before it could disturb the cloudy layer, and you lift the small oaken pail one last time and dip it carefully into the bunghole, scooping out the remaining liquid with a slow, gentle motion that does not stir the lees. The cider you collect is perhaps 2 gallons, no more, and it is the sacrifice that every racking demands, the small portion of the batch that must be left behind or drawn off separately, because it is too close to the sediment to be included in the clear, bright cider that now rests in the new barrel. You carry this last pail across the cellar to a stone jar that stands in the corner near the steps. A jar with a heavy, close-fitting lid that will keep out the air, and you pour the cider into it through a cloth, catching the last few wisps of sediment that have found their way into the pail. This cloudy cider will not be aged with the rest. It will be taken to the kitchen and used in cooking, or poured into a small cask for the pig's trough, or simply drunk in the next few days by the family at table. Its slight cloudiness a reminder of the process that produced it, and a small palatable imperfection that no one will mind. The lees that remain in the old barrel are now fully exposed, a thick, pale, cloudy mass that covers the bottom curve in a layer as deep as your hand, its surface faintly dimpled where the last drops of cider fell from the pail. The lees are not waste, though they are no longer wanted in the cider. They are a rich accumulation of yeast and apple solids and fine, suspended particles that settled out during the weeks of fermentation, and they have their own uses, their own quiet value. You take a flat wooden scoop from the tool rack, a scoop carved from a single piece of willow and worn smooth by years of this same task, and you begin the slow, careful work of transferring the lees from the barrel to a smaller stone jar that will be carried to the kitchen later. The scoop dips into the cloudy mass with a soft, sucking sound, lifting a load of pale, yeasty sludge that quivers like a jelly on the flat blade, and you tip it into the jar with a single deft motion, the lees sliding from the wood with a wet, slapping plop that echoes faintly in the stone container. You repeat this motion many times, the scoop rising and dipping and tipping in a slow, steady rhythm that is the final variation of the day's work, a quiet, repetitive coda that will not take long, but must be done with care, so that none of the lees are spilled on the clean clay floor. The old barrel, when it is finally empty of both cider and lees, is a hollow, dark cylinder that smells strongly of yeast and wet oak and the faint, sour tang of completed fermentation. It will need to be rinsed with boiling water before it is used again, a task that will fall to another day, perhaps tomorrow or the day after, when the kitchen fire has heated a large cauldron of water and the steam will rise through the cellar in warm, drifting clouds. For now, you simply tip the barrel on its cradle so that any remaining moisture will drain toward the bunghole, and you leave the bung out so that the air can circulate and dry the interior, preventing the growth of molds or the souring of the wood. The barrel stands in its tilted, open state with the patience of all the other barrels, a vessel that has done its work and now waits to do it again, an endless cycle of filling and emptying and cleaning and filling that turns with the slow, steady rhythm of the seasons. The stone jar of lees is sealed with its heavy lid and set beside the steps where it will be collected later and carried up to the kitchen, and the scoop is rinsed in the bucket and dried with the same care as all the other tools, its willow blade pale and clean, its handle dark with the oil of your palm. You hang the scoop on its hook, a small unobtrusive peg near the bottom of the rack where it has always hung, and you step back and let your gaze take in the cellar in its returned state of order, a state that is not so different from its state when the morning began, and yet is subtly, quietly altered. One barrel has been emptied and tilted to dry. Another barrel has been filled and sealed and labelled, and it now joins the rows of its fellows with a small grey slate hanging from its head, a new sleeper in the long dark dormitory. The tools have been cleaned and returned to their places, the floor swept with the birch besom that leans in the corner by the sump, its twigs still shedding the occasional dry leaf that crackles underfoot. The lantern continues its steady, silent burn, its oil reservoir still half full, its flame still drawing upward through the trimmed wick with a constancy that will last for hours yet. You take the besom in hand, a simple tool made of a bundle of birch twigs bound to an ash handle with strips of rawhide that have dried and tightened over the years into a grip as hard as stone. The twigs are worn at the tips from countless sweepings, their ends feathered and soft, and they make a gentle whisking sound as you draw them across the packed clay floor, gathering the stray bits of straw and the crumbs of dried clay and the tiny, scattered flecks of apple skin that have found their way to the floor during the work. The sweeping is a slow, methodical progress from the steps to the sump, from the eastern wall to the western, and the dust you raise is minimal, for the cellar is a clean place, its floor hard and smooth, its air still and undisturbed. A small pile of debris accumulates at the edge of the sump channel, and you scoop it up with a flat piece of slate and carry it to the steps, where it will be taken outside and scattered on the garden, returning to the earth from which it came, nothing wasted. The cellar is now as it was, and yet not as it was, for the work has left its invisible mark on the morning, a mark that exists only in your own awareness of what has been accomplished, a quiet, private satisfaction that needs no expression and no recognition. You stand in the center of the floor, the besom returned to its corner, the lantern burning steadily on its shelf, the barrels in their rows, the press shrouded in its linen sheet, the tools on their hooks, and you feel the deep, calm stillness of the room settle around you like a blanket, a stillness that is not empty but full of waiting and patience and the slow, silent work of the cider aging in its oaken sleep. The coolness of the air touches your face. The scent of the clean cellar fills your lungs, and the quiet is so complete that you can hear the soft, distant drip of water from the drying hose and the faint, steady murmur of your own blood moving through your veins. A sound that is the final rhythm of the morning, the quiet confirmation that the work is done and the cellar is at peace. The stone steps rise before you in the dim, steady glow of the lantern that you have left burning on its shelf. For the cellar still needs its light even as you depart. The flame, a small, constant sentinel that will watch over the barrels through the long, quiet night. You climb slowly, one hand resting on the cool, rough wall, feeling the temperature change with each upward step, the deep earthen chill of the cellar gradually yielding to a milder coolness that carries the faint, distant scent of wood smoke from the kitchen hearth. The steps are worn into smooth, shallow curves under your wooden shoes, and you know each one by the feel of its particular dip and rise, a path your feet have memorized over decades of ascents and descents, a path that requires no light and no thought, only the quiet, automatic motion of a body returning home. The cellar doors at the top of the steps are still closed, their heavy planks dark and damp to the touch, and you push them open with a flat palm, the iron hinges moving without a sound, for they were greased with tallow in the autumn and have not yet had time to dry. The grey light of the late afternoon, or perhaps it is already early evening, spills down the stairwell in a pale, diffuse wash that makes the lantern flame seem suddenly small and yellow, a domestic light retreating before the larger, more impersonal light of the sky. You step up onto the packed earth of the yard, and the mist that has been pressing against the farmhouse all day closes around you at once, cool and damp and utterly still, smelling of wet grass and fallen apples and the distant, clean scent of the stream. The mist has thickened since morning, if such a thing is possible, and the orchard is now entirely invisible beyond the first row of trees, their bare black branches reaching out of the whiteness like the arms of swimmers pausing before they sink back into the deep. You close the cellar doors carefully, lowering them with both hands until they settle into their frame with a soft, solid thump that vibrates through the ground and is immediately swallowed by the mist. The iron ring handles lie flat and still, and you leave them that way, for the work is done and the cider is sleeping, and there is no reason to return until tomorrow, or the day after, or whenever the quiet rhythm of the farm calls you back down into the cool earthen darkness. You turn toward the farmhouse door, a journey of only a few paces that you have made 1,000 times, and your wooden shoes press into the damp earth with that same soft, muffled thud that has accompanied you all day, a sound that now seems louder in the open air, though it is still so quiet that the mist absorbs it almost before it is made. The farmhouse door is the same heavy plank door you opened this morning, its iron latch worn smooth and bright by generations of hands, and it lifts with a familiar, slight resistance that you counter with a gentle upward pressure of your thumb. The door swings inward without a creak, and you step across the threshold into the single large room that is kitchen and living space and gathering place, all in one, the heart of the farmhouse, the warm, bright center around which the cold grey world revolves. The air inside is noticeably warmer than the air outside, a gentle, enveloping warmth that wraps around your shoulders and your face and your hands, a warmth that comes from the fire burning steadily in the wide hearth on the far wall, a fire that has been fed throughout the day by your wife or your daughter, or whoever has been moving through the house while you worked below. The smell of the room is a layered, complex perfume that you know as well as you know the smell of the cellar, a blend of wood smoke and baking bread and dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and underneath it all, the faint, clean scent of the stone walls and the packed earth floor, the same earth that continues from the yard into the house without any change, except that here it is swept smooth and hard and is scattered with fresh straw. A basin of water rests on a low wooden stand beside the hearth, exactly where it always rests, a shallow, wide bowl of fired clay, glazed on the inside with a creamy white slip that has crackled over the years into a fine, web-like pattern of tiny lines. The water in the basin was drawn from the well this morning, and has been sitting beside the warmth of the fire all day, so that when you dip your hands into it, it is not cold, but cool. A pleasant, refreshing cool that makes your skin tingle slightly as the blood rises to meet it. You rub your hands together slowly, working the water between your fingers and over your palms and across the backs of your knuckles, and the coolness rinses away the faint, sticky residue of dried cider that has clung to your skin since the racking ended. A residue that you had not noticed until now, but that feels, in its dissolving, like a small quiet release, a letting go of the work that has filled the day. The water darkens slightly with the dirt and the cider, a faint amber cloud that swirls and fades, and you lift your hands and let them drip back into the basin, watching the droplets fall in slow, separate beads that strike the surface and spread in tiny, circular ripples. A linen cloth hangs from a peg beside the basin, a cloth that is rough and dry and smells faintly of the lavender that was tucked among the linens in the chest, and you take it and dry your hands with a slow, thorough motion, feeling the fabric absorb the moisture and leave your skin clean and soft and slightly warm from the friction. You hang the cloth back on its peg, smoothing it flat with a palm so that it will dry without creasing, and you turn toward the hearth where the fire is waiting, its flames a steady, dancing curtain of orange and yellow and pale blue that sends flickering shadows across the ceiling beams and fills the room with a low, continuous crackle, a sound that is as constant and comforting as the murmur of the siphon in the cellar. The hearth is wide and deep, built of the same limestone blocks as the walls, its back wall blackened with centuries of smoke, and its floor paved with flat, fire-blackened stones that hold the heat long after the flames have died. An iron fire dog stands on either side of the fire, supporting a stack of applewood logs that have been cut from the orchard, their bark dark and rough, their split faces showing the pale golden wood within. And as they burn they release a sweet, fruity smoke that is the essence of the trees themselves, the same essence that lives in the cider barrels and the orchard soil and the memory of every pressing day. A kettle hangs from the trammel hook above the flames, the same kettle that was steaming this morning, and its water is now at a gentle rolling boil, the lid chattering softly with the pressure of the steam, the sound a quiet, domestic rhythm that blends with the crackle of the fire and the settling of the house. Beside the hearth, on a low wooden table that has been scrubbed pale and smooth by years of use, a loaf of bread rests on a board, a round brown loaf with a crackled crust and a faint dusting of flour still clinging to its surface. The bread was baked this morning in the stone oven that is built into the wall beside the hearth, an oven that still radiates a gentle, residual warmth that you can feel when you stand near it, and the scent of the bread is the scent of wheat and yeast and a hint of sourness from the long, slow fermentation of the dough, a fermentation that is not so different from the fermentation that is not so different from the fermentation that is cider. A quiet, patient transformation that turns simple ingredients into something nourishing and good. Beside the bread, a wedge of cheese rests on a wooden plate, a pale yellow cheese with a thin, natural rind and a crumbly texture that will soften on the tongue, made from the milk of the cows that graze in the meadow beyond the orchard and aged in the cool, damp dairy at the back of the house, a cheese that carries within it the taste of clover and summer grass and the quiet bovine patience of the herd. You slice the bread with a knife that hangs from a hook on the wall, a knife with a wooden handle worn dark and a blade that has been sharpened so many times it has a slight concave curve, and the crust crackles under the blade, releasing a puff of warm yeasty steam that rises into your face and makes your mouth water with a quiet, unhurried hunger. The cheese you cut into thick, uneven wedges, the blade sinking through the creamy interior with a soft, giving resistance, and you arrange the bread and the cheese on a clean wooden plate that you carry to the chair beside the hearth. A chair of oak and woven rush that has been your chair for as long as you can remember, its seat shaped to the contour of your body, its arms worn smooth and dark where your hands have rested through countless evenings. A cup of last year's cider waits on the table, poured from a small cask that stands in the corner of the kitchen, a cask that was tapped at the harvest supper and has been drawn from sparingly ever since, its cider now a year old and perfectly aged. The cider is a deep, clear amber, darker than the new cider you racked today, its color richer and its clarity absolute, for it has had a full year to settle and mature. You lift the cup and hold it for a moment, feeling the coolness of the wood against your palm, and then you take a sip, letting the liquid rest on your tongue. The taste is different from the young cider you sampled in the cellar, rounder and softer, the sharp edges smoothed by time, the tannins resolved into a gentle, velvety astringency, the sweetness deepened into a mellow, honeyed warmth that lingers in the throat and the chest. The cider tastes of the orchard and the cellar and the patience of waiting, and it tastes, above all, of a year that is now past, a year of sun and rain and harvest, a year that has been sealed into this barrel and this cup and this quiet evening moment. You sit back in the chair, the plate of bread and cheese on your knee, the cup of cider in your hand, and you let yourself be still. The fire crackles and shifts, a log collapsing with a soft puffing sound that sends a shower of sparks up the chimney, sparks that flare bright orange for a single brief instant and then fade into the darkness above the mantel. The kettle continues its steady, gentle rattle, the steam curling up from its spout in a pale, twisting plume that catches the firelight and glows briefly before it dissipates into the shadows near the rafters. The house settles around you with a low, creaking sigh, a sound that is so familiar it barely registers, a sound that is the voice of the old timbers adjusting to the cooling evening, the stone walls contracting with the slow drop in temperature, the whole structure breathing in its long, slow, meditative rhythm. Outside the small leaded windows, the mist has thickened into a dense white wall that presses against the glass with a soft, featureless glow, and the orchard beyond is now completely lost, dissolved into a world of pure, silent whiteness. No sound penetrates that whiteness, no bird call or distant cart or voice from the village lane, for the mist has silenced everything, wrapped the farmhouse in a cocoon of quiet that is broken only by the fire and the kettle and the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing. The mist is not a threat or a sadness, it is simply a presence, a gentle, encompassing blanket that holds the farmhouse and the orchard and the cellar and all the sleeping barrels in a single, quiet embrace, separating this place from the rest of the world, making it complete and sufficient unto itself. You eat the bread slowly, tearing off small pieces with your fingers and letting them soften in your mouth before you chew, the crust giving way to a soft, airy crumb that tastes of wheat and fire, and the hands that kneaded the dough. The cheese is firm and slightly sharp, its flavor deepening as it warms on your tongue, and you alternate a bite of bread with a bite of cheese, a sip of cider with a moment of stillness, the meal unfolding without any hurry, a slow, contemplative ritual that fills not only the stomach but the spirit, a quiet acknowledgement of the day's work and the body's need, and the simple, enduring goodness of food made by familiar hands. The plate empties gradually, the cup lowers, and the fire shifts through its slow orange phases, the flames sinking lower as the applewood logs burn down to glowing red coals that radiate a deep, steady heat. The chair cradles your body with a comfort that is the product of years. The woven rush seat, yielding to the shape of your hips and your thighs. The wooden back supporting your spine in exactly the right places, and you feel the weariness of the day settle into your limbs, not as a heaviness, but as a soft, warm glow. A sense of muscles that have been used well and are now at rest. Your forearms, which ached gently during the racking, now feel loose and warm. The ache faded into a distant, pleasant memory, and your shoulders have relaxed completely, releasing a tension that you did not know you were holding until it was gone. Your hands rest on the arms of the chair, the fingers slightly curled, the skin still faintly tacky from the washing, and they are still now, no longer grasping or lifting or pouring, simply resting, at peace. You think, in a slow and drifting way, about the cider in the cellar, the new barrel with its slate label and its tight bung, the clear amber liquid resting in the cool darkness, beginning its long, slow sleep that will last through the winter and the spring and the summer until the next harvest season brings new apples and new pressings and new reasons to descend the stone steps with a lantern and a racking cane. You think about the old barrel, now empty and tilted, waiting to be cleaned and dried and readied for another vintage, and about the lees in their stone jar, which will be carried to the kitchen tomorrow and used in some small, practical way. Nothing wasted, nothing lost. These thoughts drift through your mind without urgency, without any need to be held or examined, and they pass like the dust motes in the cellar, rising and falling on currents too subtle to name. The house breathes around you, a living thing of wood and stone and clay, and you breathe with it, your inhales and exhales falling into a slow, unconscious synchrony with the crackle of the fire and the distant, unheard drip of the mist from the eaves outside. The room is dim now, the only light coming from the glowing coals in the hearth and the faint grey glow of the mist pressing against the windows. But you do not need more light, for you know every corner of this room, every beam and every stone, every beam and every stone, every hook and every peg, the shape of the table and the chair and the hearth, of the bread and the cheese and the cider, the feel of the packed earth under your feet and the warmth of the fire on your face. This is the world, the whole world, complete and sufficient, and it asks nothing of you but that you sit in it and be still. You pour the last of the cider from the cup, a single small mouthful that you take slowly, letting it wash over your tongue and down your throat, with a warmth that spreads outward through your chest, and then you set the cup aside on the table, where it will wait until morning. The plate is empty, the cheese rind a small curled remnant on the wood, and you will tidy these things later, or someone will. But for now there is no need to move, no need to do anything at all except sit in the quiet and watch the embers fade from orange to red to a pale, ashen grey. The mist outside presses closer, the world beyond the glass shrinking to nothing, and the farmhouse floats in its white cocoon like a boat on a still, silent sea, going nowhere, needing nowhere, perfectly at peace. The cider sleeps now in the dark, just as the land sleeps under the coming night, just as the orchard sleeps with its bare branches and its hidden roots, just as the press sleeps under its linen shroud, and the tools sleep on their hooks, and the house sleeps around you, its timbers settling into the slow, deep rhythm of the night. You rest in the chair, your eyes half closed, your breathing slow and even, and you feel the quiet of the evening settle over you like a blanket, a quiet that is not emptiness but fullness, a deep and abiding peace that has been earned by the day's patient work and is now given freely, asking nothing in return. The fire sinks lower, the mist holds its silence, and the farmhouse, the cellar, the orchard, and the cider all rest together in a single continuous sleep, undisturbed and whole, on this forgotten evening in the calm of 1788.